welcome to the internet's premiere folk necromantic podcast. I don't know if it's premiere, if we're one of the few ones identifying as such, but I'm gonna stick that feather in our cap for now, and we'll see if we have it knocked out by the blustering wind coming from my own mouth. Hello, I'm Al. How are you doing, Jesse?
You did originate the language, as it is said.
Mm-hmm.
But hello, Al. It's a pleasure to behold you in static text form that Zoom allows.
And yourself, and with your spirit, Hello, gentle or indeed not so gentle listeners. Thank you for joining us for another Radio Free Golgotha. This one
it's a hilarious episode.
It is hilarious.
We're gonna get that pun out right out of the way.
Let's return to that one again and again and again, as the Golden Legend does, which we'll get to, I suppose. Hello, welcome. We are good at beginnings, which is to say we're good at doing several beginnings at once. And so we're very glad you're back for this February 2023 edition of Radio Free Golgotha. Thank you so much for being here. Do you want to run down our list of Sesame Streeted topics for this?
Yes, absolutely. So happy feast day of Saint Hilary or San Hilarius, San Hilarion. Not the San Hilarion that you hear sung to in a Spiritismo. This is actually another San Hilarion. But so Pope Saint Hilary, that is the correct order of how to identify. But this is the feast day of Pope Saint Hilary. We'll be talking about the demon legion, which is a biblical demon or reference, and therefore brings up lots of legions of thoughts, legionnaires. The herb wormwood, I pronounce that Britishly, and the mineral copper. The type of magic is perhaps a stretch at first, but then we're hoping you'll see what we're putting down, that you'll lick what we're pouring on, which is character as a type of magic. So character, not the character you would play in a play, but perhaps the moral character, the fortitudes of your spirit and soul that mark your spirit, also with your spirit. Wow, that was not succinct. And the geomantic figure is Fortuna Minor, and it's correlatingly homoshapedly form of Iroson Meji in the Ifá and Oracle. And then the which we did recently on an episode. It's interesting to revisit this sooner than rather later. I believe we did it in September of last year. And then the Tower card from the Major Arcana. Specifically, if you don't know, we're usually referring to Rider Waite, but we do refer to other decks as well, just because it seems to be the standard, if not the gold standard. But the Tower / Lightning card, because it has a complex history. And our dead magician for the day is none other than the illustrious and wonderfully ill-reputed in the best of ways, Rosaline Norton.
So we are talking about Pope Saint, not Saint Pope. Pope Trump Saint? Saint Trump's Pope?
I'm not sure. I just know that it's Pope Saint.
It is Pope Saint. That's nice. I always liked Battle Pope as well, but I don't know how official a title that is. Battle Pope.
But also because you also get like Hieromartyr.
Right.
They're a bishop and a martyr. And like those lovely terms that are more reserved, especially when talking about Eastern Orthodox saints, but these complex ones of Saint Pope.
So there's a couple Hilarys, but his emails. And I think we're talking about the Bishop of Rome from November 19th, 461, who lives until his death on the 29th or the 28th, depending on which calendricals you're using, of February 468. Is that the right? Have I got the right Hilarius?
That is who I'm putting down. And the reason, let's be clear, is, again, with apologies to Hilary, this seems to be the trend this year. We were going to do an earlier feast that we've been planning for and know far more about. And yet life and the universe have just dictated that we must put the date later in the month in order to record. So we are going to find lovely things to talk about with Hilary, because this is what we do. Normally we pick the day because of the saint, or I picked the day because of the saint to make Al play along. But this is another month of, this saint is somewhat obscure. It's not a saint that has a huge cultist following, although it is generally listed in like the top 15 saints of February because of his importance to the church, because he is a pope, and because of his battling against certain heresies internal of the church and strengthening the church in Western Europe. These are big things. So yes, this is the pope that we are talking about.
And it's nice to do one that doesn't have an awful lot of apocrypha associated with them, or extra stories. There's a bit here in the Golden Legend which you want to get stuck into, but it's nice to look at again one of the more realer ones, so to speak, if that's not unfair to the other also real but also slightly more mythic ones. So we've already cracked a hilarious pun, but that's literally what the name is derived from, right? Hilarius, meaning hilarious or cheerful. And the Golden Legend says because the saint was always cheerful in the service of God, which is nice. But then because it can never be done with just one little folk etymology, it has to give several more as well. The name is also like Hilarius, which comes from altus, the one from on high, and ares, meaning virtue, because he was high in knowledge and virtuous in his life.
There's already a character reference. Lovely.
Right. And indeed might be from Hyla, the primordial matter, which even the Golden Legend says is, quote, obscure. And Hilary's words, both spoken and written, were obscure and profound. So we have a start here for Saint Hilary, who is a native of the region of Aquitania, and who eventually becomes bishop of the city of Poitiers, who is said to have risen like the bright morning star amongst the other stars, which is also a telling little reference there, whether or not we're clued up on Isaiah or not in terms of rising like the morning star. But what would you say? I mean, I think it's probably their popedom, right? That they're most infamous for, along with this synod, which gets referred to as the robber synod of Ephesius eventually.
Yeah, I think I think this is also a great example of how to find hooks within any holy figure and find out how we can use them on the sorceress or witch or like dual observant level.
Yeah, love it.
Even though Hilary is an obscure saint, what are the things that we can look at for appeal as? And he already has less of like, I'm a patron saint of these things because he's a pope. And popes who are saints generally, other than like Peter and some of the more outstanding ones, don't have that kind of people are praying to me a lot for these things. He's right. He was born in Sardinia. He's in that area of obscurity of Hispania and Francia, and these areas that are in the early church. When we're talking here, the 5th century, there's already a lot. This is a shift already to include and encapsulate ideas of what the church is believing, because the early church has expanded. And the arising of certain heresies, especially with Arianism, I believe. So denying the divinity of Christ is Arianism, and this gets complex, right? We have the idea that specifically that God is both, or that Jesus, the Christ, is both human, aka Jesus, and divine, the Christ, is an important part of Catholic belief. And so this is not something to be looked down upon. There's certainly a rise in this as it's happening. Arianism itself is the first of the great heresies, right? Like, this is a huge decision to decide that Jesus does not have a divine nature, that Christ is merely a man. And this threatens the stability of the church in many ways, right? Because we're already establishing a historical presence for the Christ as part of the legitimacy of Roman Catholicism or Latin Catholicism, because like, if we really want to be truthful, Roman Catholicism is an epithet given by the Protestants later on. But we're Latin Rite Catholics, and the supremacy of the See of Rome as the center of the world, the center of the Christian world. And Arianism at this time is threatening a unified belief, and it threatens the nature or belief that the Godhead is not able to be two things at once. In fact, I think the way that it can be described is that through him the world was created and was granted all the divine attributes except divinity. That Jesus is a piece through which God the Father speaks.
Right.
A medium, or the matter that is used to enact in the world, but not God himself.
Yeah, it's from what I gather of it, it isn't about saying Jesus is less important. If anything, it's a way of saying he's more important because he didn't have superpowers necessarily. Still able to perform miracles and so on. I don't think that's contested, but it solves the whole oil and water problem of how is he, what does it mean usefully to say someone is God or part God while they're also enmattered and eventually nailed to wood.
Yeah, I think there's a great reaction against the increasingly taken for granted worldview that there's magic or the supernatural at every corner in this time period. And it's in some ways the revolution of it was to say that Jesus is not of those things, that there's something different.
Right. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be read as a dismissive or reductionist approach, or certainly not what by the early modern they want to call like a seducist or an atheistical kind of position. It's a way of simply not getting het up in a bunch of deep theological kind of like overcogitation, right, about like divine in matter and materialized divinity, etc.
Yeah, there's also his predecessor, right, Leo, is also having a heightened tolerance of schismatic sects. So Leo is not encouraging Arianism specifically, but is encouraging or at least allowing for differences of opinion arising within regional sects and their interpretations of things. Yeah. And this is threatening the unity of the church. Certainly, you also get into the Macedonian heresy is another one that's cited as being pivotal to like Hilary's like this. This is not good for uniformity. What's interesting about this is that I would say like, and I think that it's something to consider even in pointing out in further episodes, is what does that make this saint good for? Unification of thought is really lovely. Like if you're having problems finding the point, then Hilary is a saint that is good at doing that. Yeah. By their nature and struggling with their own writings and trying to find a unified voice of the church. I think as someone who struggles with writing all over, it's kind of that thing that we've talked about, that a good paper, the conclusion writes itself. And sometimes if you're around like 7 out of 10 pages and you don't know what your conclusion are, you kind of got to go back at that point and figure out what you're getting towards. And that Hilary is literally literally, figuratively, somewhere, summarily, a Pope saint that can be used perhaps to find things simple, which is a pun because the successor is Simplicius, the following Pope. But I also love the fact that he's dies on leap day, and therefore is canonized as part. His feast is the 28th because you don't always get a leap day, but the nature of being forgot, like that only 1 out of every 4 years is your feast day actual, and is quite hilarious.
A time out of time again. So an intercalary saint for an intercalary period. I love that idea of like unifying thought. Golden Legend also gives us some good old-fashioned necromancy. He's said to have restored the life of an infant who had died without baptism when he came back to the island, along with casting snakes out, which is always nice, right? He's said to lay in the dust for a long time and pray, and the old man and the infant rose together. The old man from his prayer and the infant from death, which is we love some dusty necromancy, which is glorious. There's also some lovely punning around being gallus, meaning either a Gaul or a cockerel, right? So we have this wonderful back and forth when finally Hilary does sort of confront whichever Pope Leo it is, and there's also some not contesting of that, but some admitting that we're not quite sure which one it is necessarily. At that time, Pope Leo, led astray by the perfidy of the heretics, convoked a council of all the bishops, and Hilary went to it, though he was not invited. So already for a start, unifying thought does not necessarily wait until it is invited to do things.
Yes.
The Pope, hearing that he had arrived, gave orders that no one should rise to greet him or offer him a seat, which is rude. Hilary came in and Leo said to him, "Are you Hilary the cock?" "I am not a cock," the saint responded, "but I was born in Gaul and I'm a bishop of Gaul." Gallus, are you French, right? And then Leo responds, "So you are Hilary from Gaul and I am Leo, apostolic bishop and judge of the See of Rome." Hilary apparently responds, "You may be Leo, but not the Lion of Judah. And if you sit in judgment, it is not in the seat of majesty." Apparently to this, the Pope rose angrily, saying, "Wait a little while until I come back and I'll deal with you as you deserve." Hilary then kind of predicts his death. And it's like, "But if you don't come back, who will answer me in your place?" Leo says, "It won't be long. When I get back, I'll take your pride down a peg." And the Pope take care of a need of nature, supposedly it says, but is then seized with dysentery supposedly, and perishes Oregon Trail style. Apparently Hilary, hearing this, quotes Psalms 23, "The earth is the Lord's." But then the golden legend takes a kind of like backseat and is like, there is, however, some doubt about the miraculous death of Pope Leo, because there's nothing about it in the scholastic history or the tripartite history, but also because the Chronicle has no record of a pope by that name at that time. That Jerome also says, like, the Holy Roman Church was always kept itself spotless, and so continue for all time, unstained by any heresy. So it's also there's a little bit of a like, okay, in order for Hilary to be saintly and cool, we have to have some heresy for him to be fighting, but we don't want to be too clear on when that heresy was exactly and who had to be the bad guy to his goody, right? Overall, it said there might, however, be thought that at the time someone named Leo was Pope, not by canonical election, but by tyrannical usurpation, or perhaps Pope Liberius, who was on the side of the heretical Emperor Constantine, who was also called Leo, right? So there's this idea that we're not quite sure which Leo it was, but one of those Leos was dodgy, and we don't point fingers too closely at the black hat clergymen in our stories, just in case we need them to be a good guy at some other point. That's also added, that complication is added by a further complication, because Hilary, when he was old and infirm, knowing his end was near, called for the priest Leontius, for whom he had a deep affection. And Leontius does a bunch of stuff for him as he's dying. So we have another Leo close to him as well, just in case it wasn't confusing enough.
It's interesting too, because we know that it was Leo the First before him, but that means that by 1,000 years later, it's already getting confusing for people, and that Leo the First, who is at odds with Hilary at different times, is also a doctor of the church and one of only two popes that is, and that's fascinating. As in that it binds me to them both. I'm curious too, because there's an episode where Hilary goes as one of the papal legates and like refutes it, like they refuse to read his letter, and that is from Pope Leo, and they go off and they have a sentence with everything, and they condemn somebody, or Flavian of Constantinople, I think, and pronounce. Then all Hilary gets up and says is "Contradicitur," which is basically saying, "I annul the entire sentence in Leo's name," and sits back down because they didn't read his letter. So he was just like, "I'm sitting here with the authority of the Pope." He's not even Pope yet, but he's just like, "We're done." So I like the fact that he, like, it's summarily, in summary, hilariously just is like, "Fuck this." Like, I'm not going to waste the breath. So I personally, I'm seeing this cultus of writing and thought and thesis that seems to be a possibility with such a figure.
Right. And such clarity doesn't wait for an invitation. It strikes while the iron is hot, and also doesn't necessarily need to mince its words or frame everything in ornate or overly verbose legalistic challenge. It can simply be the legalistic challenge.
Yeah, it's almost invoking the finality of thought is not necessarily to your advantage as a writer. But it might be to your advantage to understand where everything is going, so that you can then choose, in our other languages of traditions, choose the road that you wish to walk down more accurately and spend time with.
Yeah.
Of interest to me too is where he's buried, because Leo before him was the first pope buried in St. Peter's Basilica.
Oh.
And Pope Hilary is buried in St. Lawrence's outside the wall. So he's buried alongside St. Lawrence and St. Stephen, who's the first martyr. St. Lawrence and St. Stephen are the under altar saints. And then there's a number of what do you call it? Niches and little areas below as well. And so there's the patriarchal basilicas that are there. This is one of the primary churches of I believe it's one of the 7 pilgrim churches of Rome. So it's outside the original city walls, but was an important burial place for saints.
Yeah. And you've got that continually, because Stephen isn't just the first martyr, he's the first martyr stoned outside the city walls. And so when you've got a St. Stephen's church, it usually marks at least a town's old walls.
Yes.
And usually it also marks that they're, thriving enough to need to do something, to need to expand outside of those walls as well. So it's always an interesting one. I was also fascinated by Hilary's devotion to the Johns, to John the Evangelist and John the Apostle.
How Masonic.
So yeah, exactly right. Well, I mean, also he literally installs a couple chapels and dedicates them. So during the whole robber synod incident in when was it? Was it 449 before Common Era? It's not a popular synod, right? He has to flee, and so he hides himself in the crypt of St. John the Apostle, and he attributes his deliverance to the intercession of the apostle. And so over the ancient doors of the oratory, apparently the inscription was set in to St. John the Evangelist, the liberator of Bishop Hilarius, a servant of Christ. Right? He also erects a chapel of the Holy Cross in the baptistry, a convent, 2 public baths, and libraries near the Church of St. Lawrence, right outside the walls. And he builds another convent within the walls. But yeah, this concept of putting up religious buildings in the name of the Johns is really interesting. So for a start, though, all Johns become one John at that point, a little bit, right? It's the crypt of St. John the Apostle, who is kind of named after John the Evangelist, right? And so that's who the inscription runs to.
Or John the Baptist, yes.
Yeah. And that's nice to have as a little precursor to talking about Wormwood later as St. John's Girdle.
There's also the importance, which we briefly went over, but his decisions to kind of unify the churches of Hispania, which at that time were a hotbed of we'll do whatever the fuck we want, and creating their own jurisdictions. And he through both threat as well as coercion, allowed certain people to retire from this and recognize the official See of Rome in this way, and we'll bring you back into the fold. And it was done in a way that was not considered too extreme, and therefore the peace of the kingdom of Rome, as it were, is heavily attributed to him, which is quite fascinating. If whether we lost the battle records or it really was just let's talk this out, which for a piece of the official pie, I'm sure many did.
There are 2 bits of candle mystery if we're talking about practical kind of sorcering, ensorceling with a lesser known or lesser bothered saint, which is that the golden legend says that he pulls a full ET and starts glowing before he passes. So when he's old and having performed many miracles, a great light, so bright that the priest could not bear it, shone about the bishop, and as the light slowly faded, the saint departed to the Lord. And he flourished about the year 340 in the reign of Constantine. And his feast day is described as the octave of Epiphany, which is always nice. So this idea of this great light. But the second part that makes me think of candles is that there's a minor wax miracle that's reported, which is the last thing the golden legend has to say about Saint Hilary. 2 merchants owned a block of wax, and one of them offered the wax at the altar of Saint Hilary, though the other refused to do so. Promptly the wax split into 2 parts, one remaining with the saint, the other returning to the merchant who had refused to offer it. There's not really any explanation as to how that relates to anything else. But then we move on to Saint Macarius, and we're done. So I think of that being the last thing. I think of how I love repairing to the old GL, because again, it's it's not just one of the main sources of hagiography written down. It's read in church, every week for centuries. And so ending sermons or ending the reading, at least before the sermon, with this little tale of how hilarious it is to get back what you've offered, or to split your offerings. And again, the links between wax as impressionable and wax as a means of light, to see what is read, what is written, to have a light to curse the darkness by, all those kinds of concepts interests me.
My brain bilingually, just you start talking about wax miracles and the pun, which I don't think exists in Latin the same way, but in Spanish at least, that será is, be, right? That it's like the que será type of thing, right? What will be. Mm-hmm. But será is also that's with an S, but with a C is wax. And I try to think of all the puns that is, and the kind of like hodie cras type of punning of what that might be, and the ET finger that glows that will cause things to be.
Well, his daughter's got bee mysteries as well. The apiary kind, because she's called Apia, right? She's also named after the bees, like not quite Melissa style, because that's the honey, but Apia is where we get apiary, right? Apiarist from. And she's also significant because she chooses holy virginity instead, and she's got her own little stories. But yeah, there's also some even more wax and the animals that make it is all tied up there.
One of the reasons to put Legion as a demon, of course, of which there are many reasons, a reason is for the idea of grouping things singularly under a title or office, which does seem to be done grimoirically and is certainly part of practice within contiguous, let's say, demonic traditions of practice. And it might not be something that is explicitly stated as part of those practices. And I'm sure Al will go into this with much more quotage and footnotery, but oral footnotery. Foot and mouthy.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So so looking at Legion, which itself does mean many, is used to refer to the demons in the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus encounters a possessed man and calls on the demon to emerge, demanding to know its name, and which is part and parcel for exorcisms. And the man says that he gives the collective name of Legion. And this is both taken as, the demon's name might be Legion, but also to say that we are many, and that fearing that Jesus will drive him out into the world and into the great abyss, shale bound, that instead Jesus casts the demon into a herd of pigs that then rush into the sea and are drowned. Pigs being an unclean animal and therefore a fit body for a demon to go into. And there's lots of speculation on that. Even I've seen over the years of like pigs being the closest meat to humans and therefore a fitting substitute for things that which like to possess humans, not just for their uncleanliness otherwise. But the Gospel of Luke also revisits the same story, and Mark is considered the Q Gospel, right? This is the source gospel of the primary three Gospels that are, John is an outlier. John's doing his own thing. But Luke and Matthew also shorten the same story. And in Matthew, it's suddenly two men. So Legion himself is possessed or possessing two men. The demons are the person themselves becomes Legion, which is fascinating.
Right. We de-individualized even more. So rather than it being one demoniac, one possessing demon, it's already by Mark, it's already one possessed person possessed by many demons. Which also identify under a collective noun, which is also a proper noun of Legion. And then the story is multiplied again, so it's multiple people being possessed by the same gang of spirits.
Yes, and that by the time we get to Matthew, which is the shortest of the accounts, we also know that the demons are unnamed. So it is specifically in Mark where the demon Legion is named. And so we get this idea between the Roman army, right? As like there's the word legio or legio, which will be used as an indescript but just not nondescript, but a large quantity, unnamed large quantity, unspecified, that's the word I'm looking for, large quantity, which also then has a reference to as much in the Gospels and the New Testament does to Roman terms as the occupying force of Judea, that it's between 3,000 and 6,000, that we are legion, that there are so many of us in running rampant in the average peasants of the country.
Right. Yeah. So there's a professor of New Testament language and literature, Michael Willett Newhart, who has authored stuff on the Gospel of Mark and makes the kind of like political propaganda of this explicit, and says that readers around this time, around 70 Common Era, would have associated the name legion with Roman military formations specifically, which were active in the area at the time. Yeah. And so the intention may be to show that Jesus is not just better than demons, he's also better than these, demonic foreigners coming over here and building roads, etc.
Which also fulfills in part what the Messiah, the Moshiach, was expected to do, which is to expel the non-native forces.
Right.
Even though that's not something that Jesus does later.
Right. And then that kind of hashtag teach the controversy is controversialized by biblical scholars like Seun Kim, who points out that the Latin legio or legio was commonly used as a loan word in Hebrew and Aramaic already, to indicate, as you said, like an unspecified but large quantity. And so in the New Testament text, it's used as a proper name, and in this sense, like kind of can have its cake and eat it, in terms of, yes, it gets to have all of these like anti-Roman propagandist values, but it's also just talking about an uncounted or even uncountable a multitude of demonic spirits.
Yes. So segueing from that, because that is the thing that allows us to, we make up our own rules, but the thing that is an interesting ingress into discussing the demon legion, which is, what does that mean? But also to borrow the parlance from at least the English translations of grimoiric material, where a demon has so many legions working under them.
Right. This is a classic part of an office of a spirit, which can refer the office or officerium can refer to the book itself, like a
I like this
spirit list, right? But it can also refer to the specific functions, the purview, that will later start to have more of a context of how they cometh forth, like what they, if not look like, the associate imagery with them, their goetic heraldry, if you like. But pretty early on, we start to include that whichever named demon we are reading the office of or recording the office of, along with what they do, like he teacheth a man to go invisible, or liberal arts, which seems a common one in terms of the clerical underground, both being dodgy people pretending to be priests in pubs to sell handwritten grimoires on the down low, but also the repair of many student clergymen desperately trying to cram for his exams, which I love as the smart drugs of their day. But what's interesting about looking at the legions of, like, not only does this spirit such and such look like this, or can in some of the earlier accounts can be summoned by an image that is wrought in this way, but it also typically includes how many legions they command. And what's interesting in the earlier records is it seems that we start low. Baal, as an example of a particularly popular demon, we've talked about Baal's firstness a lot. Yeah. And the links have been made by many etymologists and many person dancing the onomastics of it to talk about Baal as Lord in general, and Baal specifically, or Boel, even if we're going to include some more explicitly lunary stuff to go on with all of his solary kingship, is that he starts off with 6 legions in some of the earliest accounts I've read, and that quickly gets replicated as these spirits' offices shift in terms of editing and copyist errors and shifts of emphasis. One of the things that starts to happen is the legions start to grow as the spirits become more popular, interestingly enough, as they are circulated more commonly and in more texts. That number of 6 legions for Baal, for instance, becomes 66 very quickly. And I'm fascinated by the idea of them swelling the ranks of their legions as the manuscripts and spirit lists themselves become more popularized, right? That perhaps we are seeing a paper trail for the spirits becoming considered more powerful, or at least more variated. So the other difficult or interesting thing about the legions is that they aren't necessarily explored to a great degree. We aren't necessarily told very much about what these legions consist of, for these various demonic spirits. What we do have is a clear set of protocols of engagement, if we like, about calling a senior named spirit in order to send forth their familiars, which can be a term that complicates things when we start to get into like English versus continental witchcraft, and I think has a slightly different context for British cunning folk, who are also said to have like familiar imps of various sorts, which are more like their primary working spirits, if that's not just adding another term to confuse things. So we do have this idea that there are they have other spirits that they can send, and it's kind of implied that these are coming from the ranks of these legions. But one of the ideas that I'm also interested in, although haven't found a great deal of evidence for, is that potentially these some of these devils, Glanville, for instance, reports a folk eschatology that suggests that some of these stories of devils or the devil being easily outsmarted, this kind of older, if we're going by the archaeology of this demonology, that like a local unclean spirit or nature spirit or pagan devil that will later be called the devil by Christian apologists and heresiographers is outsmarted, right? We're already dealing with conflicting elements by the time we get to, you know, the Reformation, and the idea that the devil, the man in black, is now this very powerful personification of all evil, and not just, you know, someone that can be outsmarted in a fiddle context in Georgia. There's also this notion that Glanville explores of like, maybe these earlier devils that were tricked, so they turn up looking like dead magicians sometimes. Hashtag dead magicians, everyone take a drink. And so I'm really fascinated by this idea that their legions might include, and this is like highly speculative, that they might include the magicians who worked with them in some sense. And so this idea, which, you know, gets kind of picked up as both an explanation as to how these are devilish but not the devil, as well as what happens if you give your soul to these spirits, if you are not careful with the pacts you make. Now that's at odds a lot of the time with the idea that many of these pacts from like Grandier onwards don't necessarily mention anything about souls, but then we're into wider conversations about implicit and explicit pacts in the wider demonology.
I do like that brings up one of the primary discussion points of the cachizos of Quimbanda of Eshun Pombagira being themselves former workers of Quimbanda, which is a belief especially promulgated starting in the 60s through a spiritist lens, through an Umbandista lens. It is not necessarily reflected in all lineages of Quimbanda because it's so diverse, but the idea that Eshu so-and-so is actually a former worker of Quimbanda itself, by which is generally meant necromancy, without or an Africanized necromancy of something similar in its scope of practice, because there's also, you know, Eshus and Pombagiras from around the world in these incredibly complex spirit descriptions that are put out starting in the 60s, let's say, in pamphlets. And so it speaks to the kind of whether this is independent variation, but we know that there's grimoiric influence as to how these spirits are described, if not more than that. And if nothing else, the difference between, like, as you're saying, of Baal having 66 legions, but Belith, I think, is 85, right? And we're talking about rank there. They're not equal, right? One commands more than the others, but Baal is still in primacy. And it just as a simple example, or that Person has 22 legions, and this is distinctly far less in number. And I don't know if, why do I blank on, I don't even remember Payman's number right now, if Payman even has 200. There we go. I was like, Payman is a lot, but it was like, why do I not remember the number? Because I am human and my brain does not work all the time.
In some of the earlier accounts of the kings, you also have these like hugely grandiose depictions or heraldry, as I prefer to think about them. Oriens is said to appear sometimes with 100 horse heads. And so this idea of which is the spirit and which is the steed of the spirit, and is the spirit is the steed a different spirit that they're riding, or is it, a spirit that occupies more than one body, again, to get back to that concept, right? Those demons that turn up holding snakes or riding dragons that might also speak to you is really interesting there.
The Belial of 80 legions of demons and 50 legions of spirits under his command.
Yes. So we're even separating from there are legions and also there are spirits, right? Along with sub-messenger kings as well, especially for the four of the directions, Oriens et al., who are said to have at least two sub-kings each, who are often named, but not always, and their names also vary a great deal across different manuscripts.
So looking at how hierarchy affects things like authority and even the ability to have an utterance be something from someone higher than, I'm reporting on behalf of so-and-so, echoing Hilary's contradiction, right? And saying on behalf of Pope Leo, no. And that's what it can be. We understand already that there's a history in how hierarchy works within the frameworks of which our demons are presented, that one can speak with the authority of one above it if it's been granted that in a specific circumstance. Right. So the idea of legions then lends itself to, we don't know if it is the Baal that we are talking to, but it is something that for our purposes at this level is allowed to call itself Baal if we've gone through the proper restraints and disciplines to make sure that it is something on the channel of Baal coming through. But this brings up a distinct disagreement in even the modern magical community that allows for differences between individual perceptions and experiences with said lists, right? And this can get very heated very quickly. So I'm not trying to espouse one better than the other, but I think we're right. But that's just that. I think that's also because of my experience in similar traditions, where I'm not going to pretend that what such and such king of the classic 72 Solomonic, because as my experience is more that and I know you have a lot more experience also with True Grimoire Verum, but that I don't mistake my experience with, let's say, Payman for a universal experience with Payman, that there might be landmarks that identify that spirit as Payman, as ways in which Payman and their ilk, their legions appear. But I have come to understand it as part and parcel, and perhaps erroneously, that I am speaking with one of the legions of Payman that I can then interact with as if it is Payman to whatever experiences I am doing. And there are times where the appearances change, or the performativity, the spectacle of it all can change based on my mood, the time of the day, the time of the year, what's going on, as well as perhaps what Payman is willing to themselves put on, allegedly, in case there's any witchcraft laws I have forgotten about in upstate New York. That's a nod to Rosalie Norton, but I guess what I want to investigate and complicate and be generative about with picking Legion as a demon is where is this definitiveness of when we call such and such spirit? Obviously we are doing things to make sure that spirit is coming, as opposed to there is an understanding amongst many practitioners and many traditions that have incorporated such catalogs of spirits into their own practices, which might be rooted in a more New World hybridity and contact with ATR, ADR, and other just sorceress traditions from a non-purely European perspective, that have allowed for Legion to mean that there's no guarantee that your experience is going to be the same as mine, and indeed it perhaps shouldn't. And that part of the plurality of that is proof in the pudding, because then we can be like, that sounds like a Belial. That's something of Belial's. That's something of Persons. That's something of Beleth's. Which I also came across recently as Bleth, and I know that we talk about those etymologies, but Bleth is a terrible name. It should be, or Bilet, is wonderful. Anyway, so I'm curious, I guess, is on the historical side and the historicity of things. Yeah. This assumption, both ways, is so taken for granted that if I call Payman and you call Payman, that we must have the exact same experience, because certainly we can't be. If we have difference of experiences, then mine must be accurate and yours must be wrong, which we see those wars recounted in since the beginning of people calling demons, probably. But also the other extreme, which is, I don't need your experience to match mine. And in fact, I hope it doesn't. But I like then we don't have to argue about that. We can just tell about, like, but how did you get rid of them, or how did you successfully constrain them? And those things are in extant practices where there might be demonic invocation through bodily and spirit possession, as you see in Trinidad or Jamaica or even Haiti. There's or Brazil. There's evidences for this thing of, like, yes, your binding of the 72 following like a Duquesnean, like, if you shut yourself off, if you bind this demon, it can no longer have an influence over you, not necessarily everybody else, which is interesting, because they, like, well, did that weaken the demon at all? Or is it just, is it which is which?
Right.
I think there's enough there for you to respond to without me continuing. I'm sorry.
No, not at all. Not at all. Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And I love that we're taking this to, or including, discussion of Trinidadian examples and practices and traditions and so on. I think what we're talking about here is like the issue or the crux of individual, we might even say individuated engagements with these spirits, right? And there's a couple things that I kind of want to get to, but I'm realizing that kind of starts with the question of, like, not just who shows up when you call, but who else shows up, right? So most grimoires say that when you start calling spirits, other spirits might pay attention in some way, right? Whether or not that's their legions formally, whether or not that's the retinues of very senior spirits that turn up with their, with their tambourines and with their instruments and their camels and their entourage, right? There's also this concept that, like, we get a general sense of swarming spirits around the candle and circle, right? And we
you light the lighthouse, to show where the port is. Well, you're going to get it.
Well, As with nature, we aren't just dealing with that one tree. We're also dealing with the grounds that tree is on, the other trees that tree might talk to, the old pacts that might have been carved into its trunk, etc., etc., etc. We don't deal in tabula rasa, right? When we deal in the sublunary world. So we have this general concept of general swarming spirits. I'm especially interested in where those might include not just spirits who are desperate for a little bit of light or a little bit of chicken blood or what have you, but are spirits that are drawn to the work because they sympathetically worked those kinds of things in life, right? That's Hayden talking about how ghosts go on holiday and advise people that like the same sports they did, right? That's dead magicians and witches potentially turning up because they are drawn to someone practicing the same thing they practiced. So from this concept of, like, okay, it isn't just this one spirit potentially, or if it is, that spirit might turn up very briefly only to allow you to speak to the spirit you need in question. There emerge two approaches to what to do about this historically across grimoiric use, as far as I can tell. The first is more of an objective or objectifying approach of tabulating and organizing. Okay, when I call from this direction, it's this spirit, except in this grimoire where it's something else. This, to me, is exemplified by a lot of even contemporary ceremonial magicians, and I see the use of it in terms of organizing various different manuscripts and trying to come to a decision about which one is right. But therein lies also, I think, the removal of you from what I would say the second approach is, which is a more subjective or subjectifying experiential approach, which is about navigating these different accounts and these different agglutinizing perhaps of and finding a way through to actually get something done, so that you aren't just weighing up which manuscript is more real than another, but working out which one is more helpful and which one is more
that's great, because that starts to get into my brain buzzy flick clit area. That was a really vulgar word. It dangles the uvula of my brain. It dingles my dongle of performance theory. So that we're not just looking at a static identity, but in that classic thing of, like, God as a verb, but then how does belleth, and that is actually the more important thing. So that it's not about individual static identity, but you're actually talking about the performance of something, which, sorry everyone, that's going to be my thing. So go on, Al, I'm with you. Yes.
Well, I mean, we're back to repertoire and archive a little bit as well. I think when you are tabulating which grimoire is right, which set of directions is the right one for the four kings, and which spirit list includes the 12 and which one has 13 under each of them, and so on. I think we are at risk of overly archivizing, right? And reifying as like, well, one of us is right and one of us must be wrong, as opposed to a repertoire of like, well, did you go to that crossroads and call, and what happened, right? And so I am much more a fan of being able to look to what experiences come from these things and go from there, rather than trying to, dare I say, armchair what kind of result you think you are going to have.
Well, okay, so what it makes me consider is the kind of the Roman interpretation, or the Greek interpretation, as it's been variously called, of when you go to a foreign place and you automatically compare those gods to your own. And there is a complication in that, because it's not so much always solely a colonialist way of doing. It is how to give validation also to local cults that can then have their own expressions of Demeter or Diana or of Jupiter. But
how to usefully overlay the maps of value centers.
Yes, exactly. And so you see this in many expressions, whether it's looking into Haitian Vodou and seeing the different nations as they're called, or whether it's Rada or Petua or Congo, or any of the other permutations of various things. Gede, the spirit has to fit into one of those things, but there's room for all spirits. And that's similar when we go into Umbanda and its notions of 7 rays, that as long as it fits into one of those colors and understands the hierarchy and how things go in a temple, that there is room for anything to announce itself as being of use to the temple and to the practitioner there.
Right, because again, we're going off what's helpful. To know what ray is to know what senior spirits can help you if it starts going a bit shonky, what kind of colors to show up in, how to time the operation. All that stuff becomes useful, as opposed
and that's the thing that I want to emphasize, is useful does not mean it supplants all other information. Right. That it's superior to all other information. Really what you're getting, and here is an invocation of the democracy of tradition and of the dead, that we're talking about best practices that are then put forward and put forth as to how to work with an energy that you may have to break from tradition in order to continue to work with. But the idea, I think, or at least I'm proposing a world in where it's not about rigidity and proposed universality, of which the West is very good at proposing at the elimination of other, these are whole cosmovision side, whatever you want to call that, of just cosmologist side. That was not elegant, that phrasing. But the idea that it is not, doesn't have to be about this. It is a slippery slope, of course, to propose that maybe it could be about finding a common language, and that as long as it is reflexively getting information back from the other side and negotiating that performance of what is common, then we have a dialogue. And this is how communication works.
Yeah. I think we see examples of this in the planetary components of a lot of grimoiric work as well, because we see it in both these universalizing tendencies to be like, which planet rules that spirit, and which can I appeal to boss it around, right? We're back to elite astrologies versus democratic astrologies, right? Inferiors obey superiors, as opposed to the stars incline but do not compel. But we also see it in these phenomenological negotiations. If you're going to call a spirit, you need to decide a point in time to call it in. So you might as well be aligned to useful, again, practical planetary coherences of virtues and spirits in order to do that spirit work.
Which brings up the layers of where I'm thinking right now, because I'm thinking a lot about fixed stars because of keynoting stuff, rewind, of fixed stars themselves being of the nature of planets in our descriptions of them, because they are beyond our normal way of dealing with things, right? So there's this, they are the highest of the spheres to deal with, and so they're described in terms of planets, but no one necessarily always agrees on which planets, and it's usually 2 that are being described to say this. So if it's if it's blue, it seems to be a positive star by virtue of its mythology or something like this, it might have a Jupiterian and and a lunar quality to it for no other reason than that's what that person was like, this is what we think. Or they're repeating verbatim from another grimoire or that might have a more detailed understanding of the mythology and the cultural contextualization behind that star. But I think this is interesting because with spirits, it also brings it up opens them up to understand that they are not just under the influence of one planet, and that specifically fixed stars are often given to spirits and deities, that this spirit is like this star or from this star or emanates from this thing more than planet, because the planets have their own deific qualities, but that is so more wrapped up in our lives that the fixed stars themselves are the minor spirits that we normally interact with. With the exception of the theories of like, circumpolar stars are far more godlike because they don't rise and set, so they don't get time off. And they govern more universal things. However, I guess what I'm going with this is that it's similar to how we've talked about in theory of correspondence, that if I want, let's say, Wormwood, which has a couple different planetary ascriptions, that I get to choose which one I want Wormwood to perform as in my spell, in my working. I am asking Wormwood to take on the qualities that could be lunar, could be solar, could be martial, could be Saturnine.
And then we're into the immaterial of the conjure, right? As opposed to the material of the component, right?
Yes.
So we're having the thing.
Which is partially that same negotiated space that we're talking about, even with demon or proposed things here, of that it must have feedback from the other side, which is tradition, dead magicians that we're invoking to say, hey, no, I use this plant in this way. You're like, today you're not. So, but that negotiated space between what we know as practitioners, as people who are calling upon this, and the power of the conjuration as a call itself to perform on behalf of what our aim is. And I'm sorry, this is real because I'm writing an article and I'm going through performance theory shit. But like this is, I'm fascinated by this, and now because then I can compare Wormwood to Legion and Demon.
Yeah.
In that we're both calling them to perform not just a task, but to perform as something that we recognize and to speak that language, which is fascinating because it does the same. If I'm called to perform and I understand the cultural context of where I'm supposed to go and perform this script that is done, is very different than if I'm called to perform and I don't speak the same language as my hosts, or I don't understand the cultural context of my hosts now calling me in that way.
Yeah. And where those negotiations aren't just personal preferences written over traditional approaches, where it isn't just, well, I don't feel like using mugwort like that, I feel like it should be Jupiterian, right? rather than this emerging just from again, kind of armchairing or trying to responsibly work out what's going to happen before you do it. The place where there isn't that is that a lot of the time the feedback is coming from the spirit, right? The call is coming from hopefully inside
the brass pot.
Right. From inside the brass pot. Yeah. And I think appeal to some of the instructions in the Arbitel is really pertinent here, partly because, in recent years, many folks have made some pretty blanket statements about what the Arbitel is and isn't in contemporary practice. But one of the things that a couple different people from a couple different angles have landed on is this curious instruction, it says, with regard to names and characters of the spirits. And I pulled it up here because I think it's worth quoting. In opposition to much of the traditional doctrine of magic, it is affirmed that there is no power in the figure of any character or in the pronunciation of any name, except insofar as there is a virtue or office ordained by God to do both. The names, moreover, are not definitive, final, or real names, whence they differ from different writers accordingly as they have received them, right? So that's a start of a conversation about Oriens means the guy in the east, right? The easterly one, the most easterly one. It says the only effectual names are those which are delivered to an operator by the spirits themselves, and even then their efficacy seldom endures beyond 40 years. It is therefore better for the student, says the Arbitel, to work only by the offices of the spirits without their names. Should he be preordained to attain the art of magic, the other parts of that art will offer themselves of their own accord, right? So it kind of says a couple things there, but one of them is like, hey, if you're doing the thing and you're facing the right directions and you're working by what it says the spirits do rather than what it says they are, and grasping too tightly to like, but how is the name spelled? That has to be the right way of doing it. That the difficulties will smooth themselves out in the course of it being real, right?
Yes.
But also that it emerges from this interaction with those spirits, much in the same way that the the haunted dream bundle of Michael Scott the Necromancer is said to be completed once you have dreamed of the spirit and it giving you a personalized name. This is my personal line that you can get me on, right? Which is also part and parcel of what a first license to depart should be setting up in other kinds of ways of doing it. Mm-hmm. But the idea that this is very much a negotiation, this is very much, and as such has to have input from both sides, from all sides.
What you're describing then is that same, there's a few things here, that degradation from the original contact that then gets copied down to give best practices to future generations, or for our own future selves that might be forgetful, that then we can fill in the blanks from our own experiences, but then those notes get passed on and the person then takes on the the kind of Azorsha / Chumbly thing of like naming the prophet or the writer and not replacing it with your own self. Which is a point of contestation for many practitioners, but also this moving towards like, what if planets or the names that we give to planets are describing offices in this proposed Roman interpretatio that can become like, but what's the Jupiter like thing of your pantheon? Like, what's the leader that's a sky god that we can grab to? And it might not be a sky god, but it's the leader, and we're going to have to preference that because I need to know how to even talk to you about your gods, which is still colonization and like this demand to be right, but there's at least a negotiation that can happen once that comes. It's that whole thing before you start an argument, you had to predicate your vocabulary, what the fuck you were both agreeing a word meant before you even argued it. Right. And going through that is then the evolution of what you're talking about is the Xeroxing of the spirits or the gods in two ways. And I like that pun because you get the Baudrillard thing of like simulacra, which is the degradation of a copy of a copy of a copy that happens when you religiously try to copy something without understanding its essence. Mm-hmm. But also Xeroxing as the death of for the original brand, in the sense that we don't use Xerox to just mean on a Xerox machine anymore. We mean it not meaning the brand, but just the act of copying something. That Googling something just means searching, doesn't mean Google. That asking for a Coke in restaurants in half the United States does not mean you're actually asking for a Coke. And this type of evolution of a term to become verb is fascinating because you're moving from static identity and the calcification of meaning into an active engagement through its gerunding, through its verbalization, interesting, verbization, through its actioning. And it brings me back again to, is a static identity, or is like a description of how this spirit interacts through the cultural trappings, language, and otherwise of being a planetary Olympian spirit.
I think it's really important, not just because we can hopefully totally individuate our practices so that we're all siloed off and that like I don't have to relate any of my things to your things, but actually that through these personal experiences, you start to develop little shibboleths of that spirit doesn't have to turn up literally with those three heads that the Ars Goetia says it has, but that there may be some threads that keep getting repeated, some motifs, some heraldry that can that you can start to compare the mouthfeel of those spirits to when they're actually in the room, right? These should be ways that we don't just individuate off into some postmodern fragmentation, but also are able to helpfully talk about dealing with the legionic experience of these spirits, which is I think another component of like, we aren't just talking about who are and aren't the legions, but also that working with these spirits has a multitudinous set of expressions and phenomenologies with it.
I don't know. I don't have anything to add other than that it's exciting. I really do respond to almost the cognitive linguistics idea of, again, that, and building upon, what is the verb? How does something perform itself? How do we know that it's said demon? Which is part why experience comes in, why having to call these things in succession, to understand broad terms, to understand in many traditions of extant practice with these things, of having spirits that can verify for you through a fortified relationship with a spirit that can then vouch or interpret for you the things that you don't know, that you trust that spirit to report to you, which in terms, it's a spirit that is familiar unto me in that way. The description of what a familiar is many things, but the idea of a spirit that speaks true to you through a personal connection and continued service, mutual benefit, is quite interesting. Through that too, then, is the idea that, like, when we say red, that it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing you mean when you mean red. Maybe you're colorblind and red is a different color for you, but you have learned all the things that are called red by your fellow humans, and you categorize them as those are red. So I have no idea, knowing that red means the same thing to you, whether I'm quoting cognitive linguistics or going into Matilda, the Netflix musical. But this idea that words are by themselves conceptually collectively negotiated, and that this is part of the wonderful trappings of language itself, that we're not proposing on a minuscule level, I mean, to the gasp of many Kabbalists, I'm sure, that when we look under a microscope, we're not going to see Hebrew letters, that the Adamic urge to name things is itself damning. But I'm also one for puns, so yeah, I think I've said my piece with this. But the Legion opens this up. The last thing I'll say on Legion is, because Legion is a specific number as well as unspecific, I love, for instance, that, like, when you're looking at, let's say, Belith, because I've invoked so many names tonight of the kings, 85 legions could mean 85 legion, like, people. It could mean 85 times 3,000, which is like 255,000. It could mean 85 times 6,000, which is the high end of what a legion is, which is over 500,000. So you're talking about anywhere from like 85, let's say a few of those people are like working in pairs, they're twins or they're couples or who the fuck knows, but like 100-ish to 500,000-ish spirits or demons or somethings under his command, because sometimes it just says legions and sometimes it specifically says legions of demons, but a lot of these things don't translate between the different translations well. And so I'm always curious what the wording is in those things. But the notion that a spirit could have anywhere and is casually glossed over by most of us in our day-to-day practice, because it either becomes evident or it's not, as to there's a lot more with this force than just meets the eye.
Yeah.
And I think it doesn't do us good. And I know that we've talked about the difficulty of, like, Duplanty's images being so prolific, is that it fixes an expectation in our minds as to how something should appear. And I love the wonderful nod to them, but I think it also is important to kind of read the Crowley descriptions, and especially the Chaots in the 90s were very big at publishing the descriptions of, like, this spirit comes like a giant purple triangle oozing juice that looks like orange juice but smells kind of like fish. And you're like, well, that's fantastic. That is totally different than what I have. Versus you get the kind of the kind of people who were saying, like, if you don't have the demon to full visual manifestation along a term that you actually agree upon that is that demon, then you are not doing the work, that it is incorrect, that if it's solely in the mind's eye, that it is no longer real, which I think is this weird trying to divorce ourselves from early modern ideas of what sight is, and understand that the people who are writing our grimoires that we are worshiping as textual exemplars of mastery, that they are coming from a different thing when they say see the demon or visualize. They don't use visualize, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, that they cometh forth from an image, right? Or they cometh forth in the form of, right? Or even from the form of sometimes, which again, I think I've ranted about this before, but there's real strong image magic in the 15th century at the very latest accounts that Brian wonderfully translated and made available in Necromancy in the Medici Library, that those goetic offices, say, oh, he appeareth like a soldier with the head of a lion, and if you want to work with him, you can make an image in iron or wax of a soldier with a lion's head, and that this becomes a fetish or focus of the work. Or like, he appeareth as a dragon, and you can make an image of snakes, and it will help you command snakes, right? The heraldry seems to be about image making. Once we start complicating that with early modern phenomenologies, about vision, about optical illusion, about what seeming is, then yeah, all bets are off in terms of like just how chimeric we can get.
On that note, in the most serpentine of manners,
Yeah.
That most bitter of plants. I feel like segues sometimes flow and sometimes they don't. But wormwood is interesting because how have we escaped talking about wormwood?
Mm.
We both had to go back through our list and be like, are you sure? And it might be in our list and we're just really bad at seeing things. But wormwood is definitely on the are we doing a Astaroth thing here? But I don't know. But wormwood is, along with its cousin mugwort and a few other plants, rosemary and basil, is like quintessential Western neo-pagan revival of like, this is a plant everybody knows. And everybody feels that they have a connection to wormwood, and everybody loves wormwood. And it has the added benefit of, I didn't mean that to sound so condescending. It's just that it is one of those plants that everybody's like, no, I work with wormwood. And this notion of working with, right? How modern is that? But it is also one of the ones that's commonly cited as like, I have an ally in wormwood. This Artemisia absinthium of that gives the absinthe lore. All with it, that the green fairy is something that we can externalize, talk about other people's experiences, often to the point where you see people just parroting other people's experiences of wormwood as their own as well, and to the point of like its own drunkenness, which is fascinating. The bitter is there.
This is great, and I think an important one, because it's another example of various bedevilries being again, I don't want to say conflated, but like filed away together under a shift from many devils to one the devil, right? That wormwood has so many contexts for dealing with pests, as well as that which springs up from the slither of them. I mean, that's the most typical sort of biblical historiola for wormwood, is that it emerges as the serpent who is ejected from the garden as well, slithering on his belly as opposed to pogoing around. It's said to spring up in their wake as they are ejected from the garden. So we've got contexts later on for the fall of the house of God or the house of the devil in the tower that we'll get to later. But overall, we have this idea of wormwood and its bitterness being a two-edged sword that we can use usefully to digest things, to ward off little pests or big pests of the mind, of the body, of our clothes, of our other crops, of our drunkenness, of our intoxication, as well as itself having those beautiful thujones, right? Also found in sage and tansy and cedar trees, that give it its status as like the poet's concoction, right? Whether or not we're talking about, Rimbaud or Wilde or any of those, libidinous writers. I'm fascinated by how it is used to deter and also to intoxicate, I guess, that it has demonic contexts as well as soteriological ones, right? So, I mean, we can start in a number of places. The word is probably derived from Old English vervod, which might mean something like defend the mind, and it's only later that by backtribution starts to be twisted as wood of worms, or or wart against worms, plant against pests of various sorts. We also have for its naming that it's an artemisia because I believe the herbarium of Apuleius claims that Diana or Artemis delivers the herbs to Chiron the healer, and hence it is referred to as Artemisius. Later on, we'll get wreaths of it called St. John's girdle, and this idea that John the wild man isn't just adorned in animal skins, but also in wormwood. In terms of other names for it, as well as common wormwood, which we can distinguish from a couple of other kinds, it's sometimes called green ginger, and sometimes called crown for a king, which is a nice one. In terms of just the nomenclature of it, because I know you know far more about the actual sort of like morphology and it's like more official herbology. It's one of the few words in the Enochian corpus that we have for a particular plant, or tatan, which is one of the very few named plants, along with like oak which we've talked about as being potentially therefore a word we can use for any tree.
Yes, absolutely.
So I love this idea of it being defend the mind, that as the leaves resist putrefaction, and it's so used in antiseptics, that its bitterness is used as an infusion for appetite after illness, to aid in digestion. As a link to maybe get in later, I love the context of it being specifically a cure for flatulence as well, and that it changes the bad smells that that certain demons are marked with for more pleasant aromas, or just an absence of them in total. But primarily it's used to drive away worms, to expel tapeworms, threadworms, and roundworms from humans, as well as cats and dogs. You see bunches of it hung in chicken coops against flies and lice and fleas. And you even start to see Dioscorides recommends adding wormwood to ink to deter mice from eating your papyrus that you're writing on. And it's this example that Culpeper runs with, because he loves it being martial, and he in fact loves it so much that he goes off like with mugwort on a whole tangent about Mars gets a bad rap, yo. Unsurprisingly, the herbalist has some strong opinions about Mars, right? But he says it's not just a destroyer, because he says, he repeats this, he says, mix a little wormwood with your ink and neither rats nor mice will touch the paper is written with it. And then Mars isn't a destroyer, it's a preserver, right?
Well, it's a destroyer of dreams for the mice.
Right. Who's destroyer? Who is the soldier fighting for? Right, exactly. And then you get, along with the kind of scriptural or the post-lapsarian historiola, you also get it as a biblical totem of calamity and sorrow, as in Proverbs 5:4, her end was as bitter as wormwood, right? And the later reference in Revelations, right, where it's a star that has fallen from the heavens, right? There fell a great star from heaven, burning as if it were a lamp, and the name of the star is called Wormwood. And so this context of on the one hand having this very definitive use to expel things that are bad, it then starts to be used concurrently starts to be used in a variety of beers as well. So it's a quick way of making if you put too much sugar in it, that the bitterness covers that in good mixologist secrets, in the alchemy of things tasting good after you've buggered them up in some way. But that therefore it starts to be used for its intoxicating qualities as well. And that's where we get a lot of the later ideas about it being the liquor of poets. Ernest Dawson will say in 1967 that absinthe has the power of the magicians. It can wipe out or renew the past and annul or foretell the future. And I also really like, if we're quoting poets on absinthe, just briefly, I really like Oscar Wilde's, because it escalates. And it also talks about this kind of tearing away of the doors of the shriving of the doors of perception, right? After the first glass, you see things as you wish they were. So very demonic, right? This mirage, this sense of wouldn't it be nice if things were like this? This reaching of hope of constructing your stately pleasure dome decreed, right? After the second, you see things as they are not, right? So very structuralist here. You start to see the gaps and the absences and the collapses, right? Finally, when you see in the third glass, you see things as they really are. And this, says Wilde, is the most horrible thing in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. His comparison, or the question of what's the difference between a glass of absinthe and a sunset, or quote, drunk on the sly with fear of treason, and if I drink no longer, it is for good reason. Certainly the Green Fairy is that turn of the century, fixed in with the intellectual Satanism, Catholicism, heresy, magic, Kabbalah, arts, the revolution of people's spirit and thought into something of calling for a universality, the increase of the train and transportation, and eventually flight, and everything that goes with that all seems wrapped up in this notion of the Green Fairy as the quintessential spirit of a generation that is more than a generation. If a generation is 30 years, there's a 90-year period that's just absinthe. And to the point where in the States, the long time illegal selling of absinthe, procuring of absinthe allows still there to be this notion that it doesn't even have wormwood in it anymore, and it's still called absinthe because it needs to be made for trade. And absinthe itself is primarily usually an anisette flavored drink that is, highly sweetened to counteract the effects of, the freaking bitter herbs that are all over it. Right. But the notion of like going to Nola and going to the absinthe bars before they, it wasn't even real absinthe still, but it was like, we're going to pretend. We're going to pretend that it is. And now it is, because you can actually drink. It has been legal again since the Barack Obama era, I believe, specifically to buy and purchase. But you also get the division between the French and the Czech, and the Czech is much more harsh and is done in shots oftentimes, and the French, which is lushed, right, and has this beautiful white opalescent quality of like the ritualization of that process, and the lovely Art Nouveau naked ladies being the fairies that you're talking with as
special spoons for every drink. Yes.
And I do love a specialized tool, don't get me wrong. But I think the justification for absinthium of the Artemisia to be of almost every planet by different people speaks, because if the minute you start to over familiarize yourself with something, that thing can become all things. We can justify it all. And certainly through the anatomy of the plant, we can justify that all planets, of course, have a connotation to it. But whether we're describing the lunar, the Venusian, the Martial, the Saturnine, the Jupiterian, these things are not lost here. There's solar, it's a plant that loves full sun and has little yellow flowers. So it's all there. And I think it speaks to its universal appeal. I would say universality, but trying to go away from that. I think I always associate with the wisdom of Solomon, because I think it's specifically in Morocco that the tea is called Sheba, and I don't believe it has any connotation to the Queen of Sheba, but my brain, it has a connotation to the Queen of Sheba because of this. And so it's also vermouth, right, is named for this fortified wine. The wine doesn't go bad, it doesn't mold because of adding alcohol and often something like a bitter flavor, which helps. The wormwood itself does help preserve things.
Roman wormwood, which is said to be the most delicate and least powerful of the wormwoods.
Reminded how, like, on the West Coast, being a Californian, of our native mugworts on the left coast are actually stronger in thujone content than most wormwoods, Douglasy. So, like, the Artemisia douglasy that is California or Mexican wormwood has more thujone and possibilities to poison the fuck out of you as well. The attraction towards the color yellow that is noted, the idea that the Impressionists themselves are all spinning off of those first few absinthe addicts and their obsession with light patterns and the color yellow and the bright spectrum of colors around lights and fire and how those things move is quite fascinating. I think because of its vermifugic qualities, and it's known that it, like strewing it around the house, it has a sweet smell in its leaves, as well as that bitterness that does get rid of fleas. And that's very helpful. I don't know it to work as effectively on ticks personally. I think guinea hens are a better remedy. But I love how beloved this plant is. It is rare. Like, we can talk about basil, and like, if you're a chef, you're like, yes, basil. And rosemary, like, if you like rosemary, you like rosemary. I know you, Al, to like rosemary. However, like, wormwood has love songs across like 200 years of artists and magicians that are just like, hello, this is my plant. I love this plant. It is the Liananshi of our calling, I suppose. Although I don't know, you'd have to go into her now, but calling the plant green ginger, I had forgotten about. And I remember in doing my due diligence for this episode of Rosalie Norton's favorite drink is green ginger wine, which has nothing to do with wormwood, as far as I know. It is actually a raisins and pounded ginger.
I know it well. Yeah.
Oh, you know it well. So this is apparently Rosalie Norton's like fond of the green ginger. I really enjoyed. If you haven't seen it, the Witch of King's Cross. It was I think right now it's on the Prime. I'll fail to say the mother house of corporate aristocracy, but it is viewable there, and it was on Netflix for a while. I don't think it's currently on Netflix. I could not find it. Not to just name all these names of places. Go see The Witch of King's Cross. I'm sure it's viewable, piratable, something. But I think it's important also because it's really lovely when there's an hour, and there's people that knew her in life, and there's a context for someone's life so well given that you get little snippets like she loved her green ginger wine. Right. And that means that a fucking perfect offering to call up the shade of Rosalie Norton and talk to her about the Demon Legion. And perhaps about, the other green ginger. So I love the natural weird segue that provides as well, even though it's probably not, we're not necessarily moving on to Rosaline at this time.
No, but we can keep backing and forthing, and I think that's one of the really interesting things of like get you a Wormwood that can do both, right? On the one hand, it's meant to keep your spirits at bay, right? Like many vermifuges are. It's said to drive goblins away, but it can also deprive you of courage, right? And can call the dead, for instance, visions of returning spirits of the mighty dead. Is one account I read. Like you said, it's a beloved wart, and so it's used in all sorts of instances for psychic work. It's as well as the fact that the absinthe of it deteriorates the nervous system and can cause in high doses attacks similar to epileptic seizures. So it's one of those like
it gives the holy disease when taken too strong.
Exactly. Yeah. It's one of those like protectors who is a bad man but better than the other worse spirits, right? It's not a I mean, there are certain artists that called it holy water, but like it's not, to compare to, I don't know, Angelica, which has so much like archangel stuff to it. It isn't protective against evil stuff because it's so good. It's that it's better at being evil, and it's the watchdog whose pointy teeth are facing outwards from.
Well, that's a lovely reason for it to be fairy, right? And to understand that on the far side of hell is fairy. That right. When limbo is ended, when the first layer of hell is no longer needed because Jesus has harrowed it, and the good pagans have nowhere to go except up, then fairy moves in, and this notion of being craftier, of out deviling the devil. Yeah. It's Satan and Lucifer are conceptually different in their natures.
And it always speaks of not just warding, but binding as well. And it's said to strengthen in how it can bind, but therefore also, potentially binds us to our own addictions or habits or being lost in vision as opposed to, acting through vision.
Yes, the Pazuzu effect. I love a good Pazuzu to control other demons. The demon,
right? Right. Yeah, and acts against all sorts of the common things that nastier demons might try and launch against you and your good daimones, right, or your helpful daimones, right? It's used to check melancholy and sickness in the loins, to make the eyes clear. It will strengthen your heart, prevent your lungs from becoming sick, warm your stomach, purge your intestines, and furnish you with good digestion. Right, that you aren't stuck bitterly gnawing on that which cannot be digested of these, mysterious messages from spirits.
I think also speaking to Wormwood's easily identifiable nature, right, of trying to, it's a plant that does not look like others necessarily once you start to study plants. And I think on that note too, one of the common descriptions of the color of Wormwood is verdigree. And this is a quick, easy transition, but I think it is fascinating here because verdigree, as its description of a color is referring to the verdigree most usually of copper, which is itself poisonous, but a desired coloring of copper, which also is a lovely way of showing the metal of Venus going from red and that I was going to say vulvic flush. Wow, that was descriptive. The rush of blood to the genitals as being a reddening, and the act of sex itself being martial, but turning itself to a venereal fertility in its greening. That we speak of the greening as a positive thing of a person towards nature, of being one with the greening world, the viriditas of Hildegard of Bingen, to this verdigree and patina, at least on the surface of copper, to give that beautiful oxidized color that we see similarly in other poisonous stones like malachite, but turquoise, azurite, and other things that where copper is so prominently evident. And copper itself being the metal of Venus so hugely, as well as just the red metal, which has its own connotations in other traditions itself, of being the metal of fire and desire, and of the lightning that starts fires. It is the red-headed stepchild of the metal world. Most metals are white, or what are called white metals, and that gold and copper are two huge exceptions, and that a little bit of copper now turns things to look like gold. That even a little bit of bad red wine reminds us of the good red wine we once drank.
Right. Some like really fundamental sanguine and Venusian mysteries there, right?
Yeah.
I was struck in looking at the history of copper that in the Roman era it was mined primarily in Cyprus, in the birthplace of Aphrodite, right? The Cyprian one, and the origin of the name of the metal, which I can't believe I didn't know, was Ascyprium. Metal of Cyprus, which is later corrupted to cuprum in Latin and becomes copper or copper in Old English, and we have records of that from at least like 1530 or something.
Which lovingly plays on our lovely sorcerer saint, right? Of Cyprian, and also just that notion, because just at the time of this recording, there was a huge earthquake in Antakya, I believe yesterday. Which is Turkey's had it very rough, but I was thinking about that, of like the historical closeness of Antakya and its neighboring right across that little gap to Cyprus, which Antakya being the holy city of Cyprian and Justina. But it is fascinating. So I do something, help people, thoughts and prayers, vibes and whatever, fuck that. But help people when you can, please. That said, the notion of Cyprium, and it's not to Cyprian, and the flagging in many ways, the hiring of Cyprian to supernaturally rape and subjugate Justina, which doesn't
Dr. Love, with all of the inverted commas around that come from the kind of people that introduce themselves as Dr. Love at a bar or something. One of the main things about like the historicity, if we will, of copper, is that it's a native metal, right? It's one of the few of them that can occur in nature as directly usable in its like metallic form, and as a result, we have records of human people using it very, very early in lots of different regions, from at least like 8,000 years before Common Era, right? That we get eventually, we'll get the Bronze Age named around, not named around 3,500, but later labeled as beginning around 3,500 before Common Era by mixing it with tin. We also have it as the first metal to be cast into a shape in a mold around 4,000 BCE. One of the first metals to be smelted from sulfide ores around 5,000 BC. But we've got copper pendants found in northern Iraq that date to 87,000 BCE. So we've been wearing it for whatever reasons for a very, very, very long time. And I even found an example in the archaeology of it of Otzi the Iceman, is the bloke dated from around 3,300, 3,200 BCE, who's found.
We didn't go see. Neither you nor I went and saw him when we were close, right?
No, missed him.
Oh, missed opportunity. Future field trip, let's say. Future potential.
Yeah, he's waited this long. He'll be all right. He was found with an axe with a copper head, which was 99.7% pure copper, apparently. Mm-hmm. And in light of our green things that are also potentially great poisons, I also learned that there were a bunch of archaeologists have suggested that Otzi himself may have been involved in copper smelting because of the high levels of arsenic in his hair, which is also used for that stuff. So again, the axe that itself is wrought from dealings with poisonous things is just really fascinating to me. The last thing I had to say about the archaeology or the history of copper's metallurgy is that apparently, and I have looked no further into this than a casual reference on Liber Wikipedia, is that it was also used in daguerreotypes, if I'm saying that right. That it's used in image, proto photography.
I use that as daguerreotypes, but daguerreotypes I like.
Daguerreotypes, yeah. Which I think of as like, I know it's not all Victorian porn, but I think of it mostly as like, salacious images of people showing their ankles off. Yeah. And in some cases a lot more. But yeah, just that the metal of Venus, and the metal that's been associated with Venus for the longest time as well, is also employed in this image making itself.
Daguerreotypes are their own fascinating thing, right? Because there's a whole culture of kind of reviving that amongst, let's say, hipster photographers. And I mean that in the best way, because it's a very difficult process to not like hurt yourself with. And daguerreotypes are notoriously far more accurate than photographic paper, but it also very fragile. The thing I think of with copper that was my rabbit hole in the research is because we have a good friend, Rebecca, who was conceived with a copper IUD in her mother's womb, and they blame her red hair on that, which I find fascinating. But the whole notion of a copper IUD, which causes more bleeding than other types of metal, is that copper itself creates a hostile environment for sperm, and the sperm is less likely to be able to implant itself in the uterine lining, into the egg and then into the uterine line, the fertilizing into the uterine lining. I kind of shorthanded that all into one inaccurate biological statement. But that in creating a hostile environment for the sperm creates a hostile environment for the fertilized egg, and therefore you have 2 counts of not allowing the pregnancy through a copper coil just kind of bouncing around inside your uterus.
Yeah, the more I look at aphrodisiacs and things of fertility, the more, and again, I'll big it up again, Jennifer Evans, Aphrodisiacs, Fertility and Medicine in Early Modern England, fantastic book. Again, pointing out that that for the longest time, medicine, and specifically medicine for and by women, did not necessarily distinguish, oh, that's the abortifacient, those are the bad things we don't talk about, and here's the good stuff that makes you healthy and fertile and pop out 1 million kids. Like that, both the metal of the virtues and spirits of fertility is also that which can preserve your fertility.
Wow. Yeah. Going back to my notes, copper is repellent to sperm. It fucks with their swimming patterns, and it literally repels them. They know, don't go near it. That's fascinating. But that also for what it is, there's a lot of complications with them, but they are 99% effective the first year, and they're 98% effective the 10th year. Such is the power of copper in not allowing sperm to be happy. So I love the kind of Venusian hold by the balls, literally, that provides.
Right. And that you habituate to its medicines.
There's also the notion of since like New World copper mines, which are a thing as well by the indigenous peoples, because most of the red metals and the gold metals, especially when you get into, like, again, my area of familiarity is more Mesoamerica, those were used solely for artifice, right? They weren't used in weapons except to decorate them, because they were using stone weapons, which were sharper and more readily available through using volcanic glass. But that because copper comes before iron processing, that when we look at it, it often speaks of, you can't use iron or steel in fairy related things, and bringing it back to our absinthe fairy and verdigree, that copper tools are allowed, that it speaks to some belief or progression from copper going through to bronze and iron as being later, and that the Copper Age is where our fairies perhaps have their origin in being, that they are comfortable with the conductivity of copper, and its highly conductive nature and its non-ferric nature, that the red metal is acceptable, even though it doesn't hold an edge as well as iron.
Right. But there isn't a fundamental transforming and, blood guilt of the earth, like, violated, that produces the more ferric stuff, right? There's something to that native thing, that you can pick up a piece of it and it is the same kind of thing that's been held for literally thousands of years by people and resorted to in dealings with other than human people.
Well, and metallurgy itself, the copper gives the birth of metallurgy, because we're basically trying to figure out how to make copper better.
Yeah.
By adding in, whether it's tin for bronze or zinc for brass, or the fact that coinage has explicitly, especially when you combine it with nickel and things like our own coins are heavily made up of copper and then surfacely coated. There's a more scientific word for that. Electroplated, plated.
No. Yeah, I was reading this in like history of numismatics, right? That copper seems to be one of the earliest coins, and then the development to using bronze coins is partly so that they'll be shinier, so it's more copper than copper.
Yes,
like that the search for its most valuable properties fuels a transformation of the thing to becoming more than it was.
There's the correlation of copper then with red ochre. Another sacred substance, and an ancient sacred substance, and even going past that of just the redness, the red dust that comes from that, and its association with native riverine deities in like West Africa, where you go to like the original metals before we're getting to brass and before we're getting to gold, is still copper for most of the female river deities, and this is partially speaks to their because copper is something to easily see right in the river if there's copper in the area, in addition to gold or anything yellow because it stands out. But this is beloved of the fire gods like Shango, that copper is his metal, even though branches in the diaspora we don't give metal ascription, but like the tools in Brazil are made out of copper or red metal that is then fused with zinc to make it less tarnishable. And of course the mirror of copper itself, which is speaking to the kind of riverine qualities, that copper was one of the first things that you could make a highly reflective surface off of with,
right?
And could pound it into shape. And so this is quite pronounced. I also think of the if copper is one of the first substances that we heavily mine for, then you're talking about carving passages into the Earth Mother itself, and which speaks of both the pillaging and the raping and the subjugation of the earth to make weapons, but also that if it is something like fire metals and you're thinking of Zeus and the subjugation of Rhea and the raping of the mother that exists in many mythologies for metal gods to do what they do even before we get to iron, but that iron repeats the same mistakes in that way. So if we look towards copper and its reddening, perhaps, which is a minor thing, and it transitions. Who needs them? But the idea in the however you say same shaped notions, and again, I'm about to make an Odu Ifa comparison, and this is such a broad topic, and I'm trying to keep it to published things so that I don't one, piss off my elders, or two, piss off myself in retrospect and be like, that's not something that necessarily needs to be shared. But Iroson Meji, the sounding Osun, the warning, the stability of things. It's an Odu of mystery. It's a womb of potential of mystery that we can't really fully know it. And it has a lot of lore around it. This is the corresponding same shaped of the geomantic figure known as Fortuna Minor, correct?
That's right.
All right, I'm just making sure. I'm just double checking along the way so that I don't make up history, because that'll happen too. The reason I speak to reddening is because Irosun does have a hint towards menses and towards the warning of that drip of red and what that means, the loss of life that is intended by that, which could also be something else as well. I don't know. We talk about Fortuna Minor in the past as being slightly, it's good, but it doesn't bode well for like big success. It's more like the small things of the day-to-day. How did Sam Block put it? The falling edge of the wheel of fortune. And it preserves things that you've done, but without the promise of any more benefit from them. So it doesn't predict loss so much as like things are not necessarily going to be productive past this point unless there's more generation of the things that allow for Fortuna Minor to be there. And I think there is a similarity there in Irosun of like the mystery of it there, of like there's a hint of in the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, that goes out with this sign of like those who gouge out an eye to see another blind man more carefully. So I love the similarities for what they are, but the resounding Osun, the resounding menses and the ancestral lineage notions that come through this, if we're quoting public sources on Odu, but Irosun can create a fulfillment of potential. And there is both on the positive manifestation, because with Odu it is believed that this will manifest, this energy will manifest, and your personal I hate the word vibration, your personal makeup and the decisions that you make in your day-to-day life, especially once this is announced, can lead to a positive integration of this potential or a negative integration of this potential. It will manifest either way. There will be integration. So if someone is on the positive side of it, we can talk about family guidance and spiritual guidance and the fulfillment of potential in that way. Whereas on the negative side of it, we can talk about the resistance to ancestral guidance, the resistance to developing your potential. And the problem is that the potential is there. And I'm reminded of a wonderful instructor in college, Gwendolyn Alker. If you're out there, you're stuck in my mind brilliantly, of at some point you have to stop rewarding potential, of you can't endlessly reward potential. The person has to make good on what they are saying they are doing.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important lesson when Irosun comes up in that way. So I guess that's to say that I'm cutting this off at the neck of like, let me talk about the Odu a little bit, because I know that we've talked a lot about Fortuna Minor in the past, but I love because the signs are linked by just a modification of their primal word, their first word. I think they're the discovering of like, what exactly is minor fortune versus major fortune.
Yeah. No, that's a really fundamental point. I think when we talk about, like you say, the lesser fortunes, the things that aren't bad fortune, it's still good, but it's, as a geomantic figure, it speaks of swift temporary solutions, right? As well as just sheer dumb luck, and crucially, the help of others. So whether or not that's like the help of our community, it taking a village. It's also a figure that, when it appears in readings, often encourages us to make the best of a mixed hand of ups and downs, and to roll with the punches and to strap in for both the crunchy and the smooth. So it's both the like duct tape that gets you to the finish line, but probably not much further than that, as well as this figure of easy come, easy go that can help us often let go. And often kind of there's a lot of coasting to it as well. Again, this idea of like you have the potential to do things, and so you are let to kind of carry on, and you make your own debts and luck, despite the fact that nothing gold can stay. It's a figure of passing luck, right? And that passing is, I think, a key word, because it highlights a lot of its shortcomings as well. It can come through in a pinch, but it can't be relied upon, again, for consistency. Right. In humoral assessments, it's often this kind of mixture of sanguine and choleric, which means it works fast, but it also means that if given the choice of doing it right or doing it fast, Fortuna Minor is generally going to pick doing it fast. Right. But there's also this, along with this kind of supposed happy-go-lucky bluster and coasting, that it also has a hell of a temper if it's confined or forced. And there we see again this split between the yellows and the golds of this solary figure, with the red of choleric temper.
Yeah.
So there's there's definitely like parallels that we've discussed previously, and that I think are worth raising again in a lot of these contexts, right? That it's luck, but it's luck from the wrong side of luck's tracks very often. And at best it often says, nothing bad can last forever, but again, nothing gold can stay either.
I realize one of the ways we can make this more practical in some ways, and it's a mean that I meant to explore between us both on both sides of it, is with something like Fortuna Minor. If you're asking about health and this is the result, what would be the notion? If you're asking about this with money or career or relationship, how would that bend itself in those ways?
Oh, sure. Well, it often speaks of some form of passing the buck, that you are also dealing with the lesser fortune that's been allotted to you, as opposed to other people who might be in charge more of the circumstances that you are trying to navigate. It can speak of a blustery but not necessarily terribly technically gifted doctor a lot of the time. I mean, in relationships, it can also speak to getting more than one perspective on things, as well as just like, don't worry about it. Dumb luck will see you right. You will find $100 in the street, but you probably won't get that raise. I reference it a lot. I've talked about this in a previous episode. It comes up for a lot of my clients who are trying to keep their head down at an office 9 to 5 while they like write their novel, or surf social media or something, in that it has these strange qualities of making you known in a place, but not for anything in particular, like not known by the excellent reputation that, say, Fortuna Major's hard-won lasting success gives you, starting your own business, standing on your own feet, all that like sovereignty of the sun. It's very much Lady Fortuna's fickle favor, where no one can quite remember what it is you do in the office. And so you are left alone with a certain degree of like passing, coasting invisibility, but not enough that anyone could point at what you actually do, which can be its own shortcoming and downfall as well.
There's a notion in when Iroson Meji is talked about or Iroson in general, of kind of being lost in the sauce, or like the forest for the trees mentality, that there's so much potential, but if you're not clearly eyes on the prize, you will get lost.
Yeah.
And that's the good side, right? That like there is incredible hyper focus possible here, but it is not you're getting stuck in the day-to-day trappings, as opposed to the big success that is still possible in this sign. It can flip to being great success. But I think there's and one of the things that's a remedy, of course, in all Odu Ifa is character, which we will still talk about. But the idea that the force of your conduct, your prior works, which also builds up relationships with people around you, have given you the tools to further your evolution in any circumstance. And that's why character is applicable in all Odu in that way, because this is, it's not the end of the world no matter what you have. As long as you have life, you can find the other blessings that come with that. You can go on the wheel of fortune anytime, both literally and figuratively.
Character is a great thing to raise here, actually, because I just had to look it up because I was like, there's something else to this. So yeah, speaking of like medical stuff, it's diseases both sanguine and choleric, and shows the sick person to be in great danger but shall recover. So again, it's it's bad, but it's not like the worst. But it also, this is the one I remembered from the 6th. It signifies faithful servants but slothful and unprofitable. Right, so it's not servants that will deliberately betray you or steal from you, but also it's not necessarily help around you that is like the most conducive to building any kind of lasting success. And so again, we're back to like the good success is that which comes from good character, not from just like lucking out or from just happening to have been there.
So they ascribe the no one knows what lies at the bottom of the ocean except God and or Olokun as a refrain for this sign. And I think the difference between the Ire and the Osogbo of this is, or the positive and negative manifestations is, one, open your eyes no matter what. But when you are on the negative manifestation, you can't see anything even when you're opening your eyes. You're so lost. And this is the remedy of like, you've got to stop and rest and plan and reevaluate where you're going. If this is about a business, then like you need to cross the I's and dot the T's. Don't go for it. Don't nothing frayed, nothing dirty. Don't emphasize the holes of things. Make sure everything is perfectly, beyond reproach, because there's going to be a lot of double checking things that are often hidden from sight or that are beyond your normal sight, literally. And without going into too many manifestations, because Odu is also wonderfully shrouded in like the remedies, and this is provided through cultural context and learning and the sacrifices that are made to do those things. I do think there's a philosophical, dare I call it that, approach to like talking about what this can signal. And I think that's also part of the beauty of where this podcast first came from, was our discussion cross-culturally in broad strokes about about geomantic figures and Odu and otherwise. So I think Iroson Meji is a wonderful way to kind of flag like, yeah, you can't get too in depth with this shit because then it can lead to false impressions. In the same way that like asking you how this applies in health, wealth, inheritance or otherwise is not to substitute for a known reader that can interpret it well for you. But to give a general flavor, we still want to know.
The womb has to birth into particular circumstances, right? It's about the actual landing of it in a reading and what else is going on that tempers it, that specifies it.
That these figures don't ever live on their own in your system. That there's either a shield derivation, or even if you're deriving, a quick, final court of two witnesses and a judge, or if you're which Ifa does some similar things but derives them separately, or Dilagun might manifest in what we call the conversation, the prescription of the conversation. But what we're dealing with here is that these signs and Odu out of context do not give the remedy that they can give when given a context, which is transmitted through the tradition. And I find that kind of warning encapsulated in this sign pretty well.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Yeah, we can continue to pick at that as we kind of circle around, but I feel like we are hopefully inexorably kind of moving towards thinking about how these specificities aren't just about exceptions to the rule that prove it, or showing off how much you know, but are also about, again, not just saying, this figure has this many legions and not this many, but rather how do we work with it in terms of developing our practice and developing ourselves. And at that point, we are talking not just about how do I get out of this particular jam, but also how the reading can help us set ourselves up for success in terms of of spiritual development, whatever that means, and that's really where, like, researching to think about the type of magic of building good character, I think really shines.
Yes, I think as further contextualization of that, I think that character is an easy permutation moving through this. And I think also, because we don't, Al and I talk all the time, but we don't always talk about things we talk on the show. But or a plan. What is plan? I have only so many spoons for planning every day, and this show is not one of them usually. So welcome to the new era. But the idea that we've toyed with with perhaps, God forbid, no longer including geomantic figures necessarily in our Sesame Streeting, which I hope is not a copyright violation. I have turned the Sesame Street into a gerund, and therefore it is productively new. But that I think this is great insight as to why it's great to keep them in, is that we don't have to go in depth. That not only is there a wealth of knowledge out there, there's literally a wealth of knowledge from you alone on your writing on this and future published books, but also the resources that are out there in huge amounts by friends and colleagues like Sam and otherwise that are out there, that this is part of the beauty of it, and let alone Odu, which is expansive, culture specific, but there are things in English now and online on and the internet and the great Alexandria that is the internet, both good and bad, that it allows us to gloss over these things in a quick way, provide new thoughts, how it ties into things that we're being talking about, and in some ways ends up becoming a figure for the other things discussed that day, which is an interesting way to look at it. So I think we picked a kind of open-ended thing with discussing Legion, which allowed a lot of permutation. I think character equally provides us something to talk about, because it is not something inherently or perhaps openly discussed in the Western paradigm as much, in the sense that perhaps it's written into the grimoires and it's understood that the person should be a person of virtue, and the fasting and the praying and the diet restrictions and things like this that are leading to a person or performing a person of good character for a certain amount of time, so as to be, to have the audacity to call upon the lineage that, names you second only to Adam in your ability to call upon things. And in addition to, let's say, the traditions like the of Ifa or Orisha, which outwardly name character as one of the primary goals, and like special abilities that you should attain through these workings, through the worship of the Orisha and manipulation, is that good character, not just character, but in English, I think we say they have strong character, is implying good character. And there are obviously landmarks as to what good character might be, but that the weaponry of good character in Orisha, as I'm just spoken about, is that you'll be able to weather any circumstance, collect your resources, and move forward and get the blessings, i.e., pursue the dreams that you have in this lifetime, regardless of what happens to you, not because bad things don't happen, but because your character affords you not to go off the rails and lose yourself. And that it is not a judgment when people aren't able to do this, but the structure of specifically Ifa is trying to get you to be able to go to diviners who can guide you back on the way towards how you exhibit your character, how you might get advice when you aren't able to give yourself any in this way, which speaks to the role of divination. But I do think that we would do well in all magical paradigms to discuss, or at least understand what we mean by character, and especially in contrast to the archetype of the witch, right, of the poisoner, of the rebellion against fate. And where does character fit into this, weird definition of witchcraft that I have, that both allows for the non-human entities of witch as well as the human entities claiming to be witch? And how does that fit in, and where does that go? And is it simply that, is it just to follow my oft quoted Fields of Blood with Karen Anderson of like, is it just religion justifying the state over and over again, as it has since time immemorial, of like, as long as we're on the same side, then what you do exhibits good character, and that if you speak out against me, but then there's also enemies historically who can say that person is honorable even as my enemy, and honor and character get conflated there anyway. But these notions of courage and trustworthiness and integrity and respect, courtesy, responsibility, which includes accountability and perseverance and self-control, as well as fairness and justice, that seem to be very intrinsically tied into notions of character and gratitude, reciprocity, what is good citizenship, and is it something that is specifically important for the magician? I will say that making law, as it is sometimes called, is wonderful for the magician to blend in, right? Like if you act normal, you're going to get the benefits of appearing normal. If you want to dress and walk a certain way, that is your right, but you will not necessarily intrinsically share in the blending in of things that you are doing, right?
There's a couple of things about this. Firstly is that, like, when we talk about like strong character or good character, we're kind of talking about the tangible actions that trace what I feel like a lot of pre-modern writers would talk about as the soul and as the spirit, outside of any particular theological metaphysic, towards like what does it actually look like to do those things, right? Sure, to worship Jesus is to live the good life, but like, what does that actually look like, right? What does good heart and good action combine as and combine from? Yeah, there are a couple notions here. I love that you raised like the how this should offer things to chew on for folks, drawn to expressions of personal power, or of like the transgressions of how witchcraft can be framed and those kinds of things. That we're talking about power, we're talking about control, self-control. We're talking also about like who you are as how you act, right? And the performance of self and the performance of good self, performance of self that is good at being gooder, right? That, we're talking about good habit versus like bad habits, talking about like limitation and who we are in those contexts, as well as like how power corrupts, right? As well as concepts of like how we're remembered, right? And reputation and things. So anyway, a bunch of different things like that kind of came up for me. I had a bunch of quotes that I was going to kind of throw at you, because I feel like I've vaguely sort of ordered them in a way that made sense at the time. I don't know if they will in actually performing them, but okay, right. So if we have the idea of good character as how we grow and learn, right? Character is good heart and good action. There's a quote attributed to Martin Luther King Jr. where he says, intelligence plus character is the goal of true education, right? Like the ongoing, always learning thing. And I like that because it on the one hand says like, yes, the lovely D&D attribute distinguishing between intelligence and wisdom, right? Intelligence is knowing it's raining, wisdom, it's knowing it's good to not get too wet because you'll get a cold, right? Like, sure, learning is like learning as like abstract and we might even call the archive is great, but the repertoire of character is really also what education and the fostering of wisdom should provide, right? So we have this idea of head and heart as well in a lovely way. An interesting like kind of contrast to that is the idea of like what is unintelligent, or what is reactive, or what is not fostered by alignment with good or bettering self, right? So you get Dale Carnegie in their infamous How to Win Friends and Influence People, saying any fool can criticize, condemn, and complain, and most fools do, but it takes character and self-control to be understanding and forgiving. I don't think this is just self-control, to be nice, right? Nice to be nice, as Dylan Thomas wonderfully puts it. And to not just act as if you're nice, but to act nicely, right? And the idea of understanding and forgiveness also being part of good character, not just because people will like you, but because there's a core of how it is enacted there. And then you get this, like, as I was thinking about this, then you get this notion of character being what you do because of who you are, or how you act or how you act as you. I don't know if the as is appropriate for talking simile or direct metaphor there, but the quote attributed to former UCLA basketball coach John Wooden is that character is who you are when no one's watching. I like how Dose One puts it, character is what you are in the dark. And so here we have a notion of like what you would do without someone else telling you what you could and couldn't do, right? Some of the better points that like some of the new atheist crowd make about religious or centralized state authority telling you not to murder should not be the only thing that stops you murdering, right? I already do the amount of murdering I like to do, which is 0, right? But this idea of what you do if no one stops you also brings in a great dimension of how we approach power and privilege, I guess. And that leads to a quote that I found ascribed to Abigail Van Buren, who says, the best index to a person's character is how they treat people who can't do them any good, how they treat people who can't fight back. And this is that great litmus test of like, how do people talk to wait staff, right? That should be a big red flag, on dates or what have you, right? Like how does someone treat someone that they don't need to be nice to, right? Yes. So that's a version of like, they don't need to have those limits, and yet there's still some social bounding of that. And that's really where I think the conversations for me, as someone very interested in like, anarchism as an approach, as a way, as a do, as a tao, as a personal engagement with power and a personal reflection on power. Like that's really where we start to talk about power as a test of character, right? John Waxwell says that in the hands of a person of integrity, power is of tremendous benefit. In the hands of a tyrant, it causes terrible destruction, which is really just another way of saying like, character is who we are without limits, is still who we are in the dark, but it's what we do in the dark, and what we do even in the light of people who can't stop us. And then that got me thinking about tyranny as something that is defined after the fact, although also often, what's that quote, only evil men live to see their own likeness in stone, right? So I guess maybe you see tyranny when it's established as tyranny, but like a quote from Wayne Dyer about your reputation is in the hands of others. That's what a reputation is. You can't control that. The only thing you can control is your character. So here we have the idea that character is how we're remembered and our lasting contribution that outlasts us. So it's not just about making other people around you feel nice. It's also about leaving the world in a better place than how you found it this time round. And I guess all of these kind of come together in this notion of, I don't know, this back to wisdom, I guess, and wisdom being won by the coin of hardship very often. This idea, and again, back to this idea that the character might be the tangible actions that trace the soul, that like a soul is grown, is forged, is worked on, is developed, right? Isn't just a weird glowy thing that doesn't show up on our senses, infused into everyone. And as a quote attributed to Helen Keller, says, character cannot be developed in ease and quiet. Only through experience of trial and suffering can the soul be strengthened, ambition inspired, and success achieved. And so all of these kind of concepts were like ringing in a series of like braiding and unbraiding kind of threads of what we mean when we talk about developing character, not just on our own, not just who we are in the dark, but who we are in the dark.
One of my questions with this is like, how is this beneficial to the magician? Especially when we allow for, like, again, the poisoner, the witch, the rebel, the rebellion against fate that I personally ascribe to an important part of my definition of witchcraft, the rebellion against fate, or the rebellion against the flow of as is, and perhaps the invocation of as if, However, here's a specific example. So one of the markers cited in the grand study of the different what are quote unquote called Umbanda or Umbandesque traditions, And I use Umbandesque in the sense that many of these traditions aren't identifying themselves as Umbanda, but will be classified under a larger umbrella of Umbanda, which is the spiritist religion, most commonly attributed to Selves de Moraes, codifying it in the early 20th century. But we know that various forms of it existed 80 years, 100 years before, arising out of what is called low spiritism, of the everyday folk practice of the Congolese and the Fombe and the Yoruba slaves that were imprisoned and enslaved and brought to Brazil, and the way that those groups are interacting with the new location, as well as new material, as well as integration of that material through various forms of synchronization, including the very complex notions of advancing the race, as it is called, to move up the social ladder through intermarriage, and the projection of how learning must be talked about in a certain way and codified. Like, again, is it the description of the spirit that is actually being told, or does the spirit appear in those ways? When we're talking about specifically Latin American traditions, it's hard to tell, because the historical record only allows for the description to be said in certain ways, and anything that contradicts that is a whole other study. But what I'm getting at specifically here is there is a group of practices called Omoloko, which exist in the 1930s, definitely documented at the rise of when Umbanda was being codified, and this understanding of the whitening of Brazil, which is a very complex matter on the historical end, but affects it on the religious end, where Brazil is importing Europeans to stop the racial disparity by hoping that these Europeans who would be given land in Brazil for free in trade for coming and setting up roots, would then interbreed with local African populations that had been brought there through slavery. And there's a lot of weird intentional eugenics and other things going on here. There is perhaps a noble effort, if you want to describe it that, of trying to erase racial inequality through forced miscegenization. It is ultimately a very strange project, but one that historically is engaged with, and it is very tricky to talk about, but it also affects the religious permutations or religious expressions that are going on in those cultures where these things happen. It was almost engaged with in the US as well, but they found that it was too expensive. However, in Brazil specifically, Umbanda started following, and its popularity started increasing because of its reliance upon European, i.e. Kardecian, and to the lesser nod to Swedenborgian Spiritism, but mostly Kardecian, which allowed itself through translation of things, through theosophy and other things, to propose a universalized system whereby every religion that had touched base on Brazilian soil could be brought under the umbrella of a spiritist understanding, where there was no more need for harsh spirit possession, rigorous spiritual hierarchies, or blood sacrifice of any sort, and that it got it under this banner of kind of this proposed seven-rayed universalist system that was interesting, because what ended up happening is they ended up open sourcing it, right? So they developed workbooks of, this is how you bring people to spiritual development and how you can use these techniques, but it allows people to hold on or emphasize certain aspects within their own local communal expressions of those things. Right. That said, Omoloko was often viewed as a reaction against this and trying to preserve the blackness of these same traditions, where you had the engagement with the Orisha, the Foduces, the Nkisi, and it was viewed as less than optimal to lose the very foundational technological, let's start there, expressions of how these deities across these three great noções, these nations, might be worshipped, in favor of abandoning them to abstract spiritual callings done through saint statues. And so just as Umbanda was considered the whitening, that Omoloko preserved the Africanness of these traditions while starting to incorporate some of these broader spiritist notions, which is a much more a minority tradition in the greater expression of Umbanda. But it's interesting to look at historically. And the reason I bring it up here for this, after that history lesson, which I think I did in a succinct enough manner, it is believed, for instance, that if an experienced mount, or an experience by the santo, whatever we want to call this person, celador, because these names will change, but an experienced transpossession priest that has built up a relationship with their own deities, spirits, and otherwise, whether it's Caboclo and Kisi, Orisha, the different archetypes of these possessions, Katisu, that an experienced body, meaning the body is trained along with the person who is the spirit that is possessing the body, right? Because we're all possessed at all times, usually with our own consciousness. Now, that the experienced body, meaning someone who is trying for good character, trying to exhibit clear communication, trying to exhibit good acts, charitable acts, to show the faith, that when a errant spirit or difficult spirit needs to speak, it can then use the body of an experienced mount, and they will be able to communicate better. They will be able to not hurt people when they come down in the lingo. They will be able to soften the intensity of their rage and ire, because the very body of the magician, if I can use that term, has been coded towards good character, good communication, good interaction with their community. Right. And this is a very specific example, but I can't see any difference in, or I would propose that there might be less difference than we outwardly think, because although I'm personally obsessed with ideas of possession and what that means, and we possess our thoughts, we possess our inspirations, but this is a whole other thing. I would propose that the magician in the West possesses no new tools for communication than they already have when they are talking to a demon. You cannot communicate better than you have experienced communication in the past. You can communicate maybe a smidge better, maybe a proposed like, oh, we can make a step, but you can't make a leap across a chasm. Yeah. If you've not prepared yourself for those interactions, you do not have the container to hold the conversation. And that is an important part, I think, in proposing why character might be of benefit as a desired thing, not just on the human level, not just for the development of civilization as we see it and as we know it, because we know that notions of civilization change. And I don't necessarily want Roman ideas of civilization versus barbarianism. Right. However, for myself, I can hold myself accountable to certain things and improve on and get better with. And that if I have learned to interact with people on a certain level, that all the communication skills I build across the board will be of benefit for when I'm communicating with demons. All of the interpersonal skills that I build upon myself as a person will be of benefit when I'm communicating with angels. Now, they must be put into their cultural context of some things you have to command, some things you must test to make sure that they are who they say they are. I don't necessarily have to test you, Al, when I see you. But just as my boyfriend sometimes makes fun of me and says, like, who are you? Where did we go to dinner last week? When I suddenly appear in the driveway and he didn't know I was there. Sometimes you got to test things, right? Right. That's my proposal with Omo Loco as a specific historical exemplar as to why. I hope that made sense.
No, absolutely. That concept of character and the cultivation of good character, allowing for a navigation of value centers, right? For the specifics of conditions and conditioning, right? For me, that very much speaks to engaging with the spirit rather than the letter of the law, right? That good character is about facing the same direction towards a bunch of values rather than a bunch of mere observation of prescriptive taboos or particular protocols, right? It feels a lot more chaotic good than lawful good to me, to put it that way, right? The repertoire of good character over the archive of dogma.
No, because dogma, then you don't know how to apply any of that.
What's the phrase that the law in its infinite wisdom prescribes against the rich as well as the poor from stealing bread, right? Like where does stealing is wrong butt up against starving to death is wrong? Like that for me is where we can meet that sense of good character can be about challenging power as much as it is about seizing it for ourselves.
Yes, absolutely. That the equanimity in character is different from equality, or equity. There's something to be explored there on very many personal levels. It speaks also to my distrust of the written language or even spoken communication without engaging it as a relationship with the speaker. In that, dogma is a perfect example. It is by the letter of the law, but you don't necessarily have the container to understand what that dogma is trying to espouse, unless that dogma is specifically being used to control, which dogma often is. because it's the conversation with someone that doesn't exist anymore, which is true of all reading. The you that wrote the article last week doesn't exist anymore, and that's who someone is reading with, and then wants to engage you with. You're like, well, actually, I have a few more thoughts now that can completely terrify and nullify the arguments you made in that same thing a week ago.
We are not just possessed of our own consciousness, we're also haunted by all the consciousnesses that we don't have anymore.
The time ghosts of our own written, or our own record, whatever those may be, written or otherwise. The parallel universes we create at every juncture, at each crossroad. This notion of regret, or of because regret comes like a lightning bolt, right? Like suddenly you realize you made the wrong choice, or suddenly you realize you will not defeat what is in front of you. You will not be on the winning side. And I think there is a notion of that with the tower that is also there in its earlier forms as the lightning, or the lightning struck tree, that perhaps as the tower, we talk about the long, slow build, right? There's this idea of the Babel Tower, and like what that is, or St. Barbara being locked away in the tower, and the liberation, the kind of ejaculatory moment of the long, slow build from the earth. This is Jodorowsky's tarot book describes this as the phallus of the earth, right? That is building up, that is ejaculated from heaven. And I remember talking about this before, like little yod fires coming down in the Rider-Waite thing, which are distinctly not yod fires in the earlier pictorial representations of la foudre. My French is non-existent.
I wasn't sure about that one either, to be honest. Yeah, the lightning.
Yeah, but this idea that lightning itself as a punishing device, as the copper bolts of the sky deities, of the heavenly fathers, of what this is. That the reference, the tower, becomes very wrapped up in this narrative later on of the Tower of Babel, or the Wizard's Tower, or even the harrowing of hell, and other ideas of, or the expulsion from Eden, which also carries with it notions of the harrowing of hell, right? Because you're rescuing the quote unquote good pagans, but that this card always comes after the devil in all tarot decks that contain it, and like I think the Visconti Sforza tarot deck, is that right? And many used just for gameplay omit the tower. But as far as the moral play that we're going here, that this slow build, this danger, crisis, sudden change, destruction, liberation, even there, because that's kind of a harrowing of hell thing. But pictorial key to the tarot, weight, is specifically misery, distress, indigence, adversity, calamity, disgrace, deception, ruin, catastrophe, and the idea that reversed, its negligence, absence, distribution, carelessness, apathy, nullity, vanity, distraction. So I like this notion here, because this overlaps a little bit with Iroson. The Iroson Meji, or the Fortuna Minor, is like a flag that we need to go back and make sure the foundation is being built correctly. Yes, we need to go back and make sure that we are not in a highly lightning, like are we building our house on rock or upon sand?
Yeah. And these fundamental crossroads lessons of cavorting with devils, right? The finding out that the 15th century Italian Miccianti deck, it's called the Casa del Diavolo, the House of the Devil, that the devil's lessons are about, yes, a big storm that reduces your house to rubble and destroys everything you thought was secure, but it shows you that the foundations were not as solid as you once believed they were, right? These unstable foundations of false assumption, of mistruths, of illusions, of blatant lies, of lies we tell ourselves. And yes, there's the ego of building our tower to like spit in the face of God, but also that that good character is about how we deal with those sudden upheavals and unexpected changes. A difficult or traumatic event will push your relationships to their absolute limits, and how we deal with not how we avoid the extreme emotional turmoil, because the tower is down, right? Those spirits are already cohering around that fragment of fate, but how we avoid risky investments, how we don't get caught up in the undertow of regrets, not just of where we've misacted, but like where humanity has acted wrongly, right? Which for me is the post-lapsarian contexts for it. But yeah, how we deal with the chaos and destruction, and where we can dance and take flight from those things, ideally, rather than plummet to our doom.
So I'm going to follow the nod from the figure and apply this towards the reading of the episode, because the crown on the top of the Rider-Waite tarot specifically is said to allude towards materialistic thought being bought cheap. And that speaks a little bit in my thought towards dogma and the notion of not having the container to contain it. That if you don't, it's the whole thing of don't seek what the seeker, but seek what they sought. That notion of you have to look beyond the Buddha. You have to kill the Buddha.
Right. Look to the moon, you idiot, not my finger.
Yeah, exactly. And this is why dogs are amazing, because they learned early on that they should look where we're pointing. But there's something in that, I think, of buying your information, trying to do things before your time. Everyone has to start out, but you also want to have the reflection in your copper mirror of knowing when you might need more training, when you might need to go above you, because most people I know in any tradition have someone that they confide in and go to when they need help. They might keep that very secret, but that's the same thing of like anybody. You have friends, you build up a circle of trust, and they might do things completely differently than you, but you trust them in when you need the guidance specifically. And the other thing that pointed out is that I believe in one system of ascription, it's usually in the Golden Dawn, I think it's pe, but that in the quote unquote French system, it corresponds to ayin. I was like, it's an I. It's still the resounding must watch out.
There's some nice kind of I don't know if it's Masonic or pseudo-Masonic, but there's some nice stuff about building the outward tower as merely a exercise for the building of the inner tower in the symbolism of the tarot by P.D. Ouspensky, publishes in 1913. There's this the parable that kind of goes with the analysis of that card says, where was it? The tower should warn people not to believe in it. It should serve as a reminder of the inner temple and as a protection against the outer. It should be a lighthouse in a dangerous place where men have often been wrecked and where ships should not go. Right?
Okay, so this brings in the pe of the Golden Dawn system of bringing in the mouth that still speaks the story regardless of the shame around it. That the truth is the truth. I was just thinking about this with there was a TikTok video going around in the decolonial circles of a woman talking about Germany's deeds in Africa, which are often not talked about in lieu of other deeds in the 20th century, but the importance of speaking of mass genocide and what that is, and that it doesn't erase it by not talking about it. It doesn't erase it for the people that went through it. What it does do is pretend that it never happened and that we've moved beyond it when we don't know if we have. That the mouth itself as the tower is someone saying that's falling is as important as seeing it to begin with.
And again, another like huge testament for the idea that a hashtag no bad vibes divination reading is useless, right? Like if the tower is falling, being told it's not is not helpful.
Yeah. Well, I suppose in some ways the tower is always being struck by lightning. It's just where is that in your life, and without being catastrophic about it. That there are always things that we can learn that is no longer the road I need to go down, and I had sudden insight into that is why right now. And we want to have those moments sooner. That the idea that a successful partnership or a successful marriage is successful if it terminates or comes to an end.
If you have discovered that the best way you can make each other happy is by not being in each other's lives. Yes.
It's still a successful marriage. That a successful business partnership is this company has run its term. We're good. We should divide assets and move on.
Yeah.
That is still success. That is still that we can. Okay, so this because Ouspensky is going to be doing Gurdjieffian stuff, right? And the Gurdjieffian notion that you can almost inoculate yourself against the great tragedies by putting small tragedies. I'm speaking to Fortuna Major and Fortuna Minor in your life, that you can take on the obstacles to build the container that allows you to contain the experience of dealing with shock, with dealing with discomfort, with dealing with quick decisions be made. Yeah, that's correct. That's grammar. That's syntax. But the idea here that maybe if we can recognize where little towers are, then we will be spared from the ultimate calamity of a large tower happening, because we can either recognize it sooner or go, wow, okay, but I have the tools. And that is intrinsically tied into character.
Yeah.
It's that side of like, I'm reminded of a supposed Masonic quote, and I have to say it that way, alleged, do not have two characters, one outside the lodge and one inside the lodge. Your character should be the same in all of your interactions. You might have to edit, you might have to contextualize, doesn't mean you spill the same way in every single format.
Right. Code switching is still a valuable skill and modality of being and engaging with other people. The bridge is built halfway between you, right? Like
a negotiated space that is not just dependent upon the mask. That if the mask is being worn, and we used to joke about this, right? Acting wise, like if an actor is very good at switching between parts, you go like, I don't know you as a person. Like, I don't know who's wearing the mask. The actor might not either for years. Developing who you are as the one that wears these different things is really important and is a great tool for not going crazy by doing completely divergent parts and taking on different personas. Allowing yourself to be possessed by different personas.
Right. All colors agree in the dark, and
you must develop your consciousness in order to take on alternate consciousnesses.
Yes.
The worship of the Ori is essential to understanding how to work with Orisha.
Right. I'm sure you've quoted to me before that notion that Ori is the first Orisha and the one that can refuse all other blessings. That if we're not in alignment with our heads, then all of the Ebo and prayer and
absolutely
work.
By a larger extension of what does that mean is that nothing can happen to you if your head refuses it to be active in your life. Someone can give you $1 million. If your head is in the place where you have to hoard that or buy it like you have no resources anymore, you will not invest that well, and the blessing will be a minor blessing. But it was the same thing I was thinking about that earlier, of how many people end up in bankruptcy after winning the lottery.
Yes.
And that's an example of the head did not accept the blessing yet. You have to train, you have to have the container so that the things take root, which is an argument even some have with like psychedelics. It provides wonderful escape, wonderful vision, but if you don't have the ability to contain that vision, if you're not doing the work to contain those visions will be fleeting. Right. And it leads us to why you chase the high as opposed to develop what you see during that high as a moment of inspiration and incorporation.
Right. That psychonauts maxim about once you have received the message, put the phone down. Yeah. Rather than worshipping the phone. So we talked, abstractly about what it is to live not just in spite, but through the things falling apart, right? Through the flung stones of those who have seated themselves in superiority, moral or otherwise, to us, and not being in any way an expert in Rosaline Norton in viewing, in reading on her biographies and stuff, it does seem, and I don't want to paint her into a corner here, it does seem a life continually navigating a bunch of no's and a bunch of arrests and court cases and prurient authorities saying you can't do this. This is wrong. This is transgressive. This is putting people's moral character in danger, which, I mean, is only one thread of a life and work, but it's one that I found myself being particularly interested in terms of how she can fit into our discussions on this episode.
Really struck. Well, I mean, she's in New Zealand, so historically, right? So brief summary, and then throw stones, please. But New Zealand born Australian, and a painter and self-named, self-styled, self-taught witch, who did bring in other resources. Of course, she was reading anything she could at the time to further this, but a sex magician par excellence, a painter whose work is always compared to male occultists rather than standing on its own. But I remember first reading about her in one of Valiente's books, the image of the Pan image in her apartment was there, and this by an early age at the Church of England school in Chatswood was expelled because she was 14 and producing depraved drawings of, quote, vampires, ghouls, and werewolves, and was most likely corrupting the other girls. And it was a battle continuously with her own sensuality, and I would say that it's I think witchcraft is intrinsically tied into sexuality historically. I'm not saying it always is in every person's practice that might identify as witch, but it certainly was for her that her love letters to a lover were deemed so inappropriate that that's why allowed them to raid, that it was on sexual impropriety, in addition to the fact that the witch laws that allowed Gardner to publish in England still held sway in Australia until the 70s.
Yeah.
And that this notion of what a witch is, and this corruption, that people made up shit saying that they went crazy after going to a satanic mass at her house, and she's not a Satanist and never did satanic black masses. She's like, I did orgiastic stuff, we did sex magic all the time, we were drunk on absinthe and everything in between, her green ginger wine that she loved, and she was doing forms of whatever she could, but she was, in modern terms, one hell of a fucking performance artist. She was a nude model for many artists, and because of her unabashed, she had no shame, in a lovely way. Like that quote that I shared with you about, like, wherever perfectionism is driving us, shame is riding shotgun, by Breen Brown. I don't know how to pronounce the first name, but like, there's something really strong there that, like, this woman is, in the loveliest of witchcraft ways, not ashamed.
Yeah, this lack of shame ends up being a source of further, if not empowerment, then like sources of further inspiration for her, right? That like time and time again, she puts together these public exhibitions that don't go well, that the police raid, that they remove paintings from, that they deem to be obscene. She's born 2nd of October 1917 and dies 5th of December 1979. So again, this is a fascinating period of the 20th century in general to be living through, and to be painting her demons, vampires, and werewolves and so on. Like she's on both sides of the artist's gaze, as a, like you say, as an artist's model. I'm fascinated by that stray line. I read that she also supplemented her income, as many artists do, with a bunch of other work, including being a hospital's kitchen maid, working as a waitress, and it also says just briefly that she worked as a toy designer, and that to me is fascinating. I love this idea. Having looked at a bunch of the paintings now, like I want to know what toys she was designing.
Yeah, I mean, God, if she could have designed sex toys, we'd be in a whole other world.
Right.
I love I believe she was called Rowie by her friends. So there's this, I mean, the Witch of King's Cross documentary has, you know, this lovely just recalling of things. She was said to be, you know, wiry, thin, and has these kind of vampira eyebrows, right? With the very, you know, that flat edged bangs that would be like make every hipster proud. She and her own face appears in her artwork, whether or not it's said to be her own face, right? Like, so when you look at the seance and there's the female figure riding the devil head, the five-eyed devil head, like we can clearly see a reference to her own face, or that she's cultivating her appearance to be like the images that she wants to paint. One of the two. So her art, the art of Rosalie Norton, was published in 1952 and did contain some famous paintings that are still very, very controversial. I love the demon Fohat, I guess I'm going to pronounce it like that, with the Baphometic image with the giant snake penis. You know, there's some lovely again, sex toy promotion that's coming out of there. And I don't mean that in any way to detract from how powerful it is. You know, she has an esoteric understanding of everything she's doing. Her magical world is charged. She is worshiping Pan ultimately, both as the all, but also in its complete madness and inspiration for an artist. And I love this outpouring of so much witch, that it is art, that it is sculpture, that it is performance art, that it is her sex magic, that it's just, when we talk about the artist as a way of being, she takes witch as a way of being, not to say, oh, I did this spell. Everything becomes a spell for her. The account of the placard on her door of the house that she's running, where she's doing these like
amazing orgiastic rituals to Pan and making all this art and encouraging other artists. The placard on the door supposedly states, "Welcome to the house of ghosts, goblins, werewolves, vampires, witches, wizards, and poltergeists," right? And this becomes part of the reason that people point a finger at her, right? To borrow Peter Gray's phrase about "you find the witch at the end of a pointed finger." It is by these continual acts that aren't just, oh, she's a witch, she's spooky, but are things that like dog and mar is the wrong term, that attempt to mar her creative expression time and time again, that she folds back into how she will live and how she will respond to these towers and these flung stones of authoritarian control, right? That like you say, she's living it, right, as this pagan, as denying the explicit satanic panic stuff, and is continually dogged by the press, publishing stories accusing her of being a devil worshipper, right? Yeah. I'm super fascinated by how the kind of like the kind of yellow top press, like tabloids, frenzy and hysteria, end up kind of like forcing her into more of this stuff as well. Like that, like by the 1950s, people are like, there are tourists coming to try and find this house, to try and find this witching woman that keeps being accused of corrupting people, right? That, yeah, like you say, the time at the time in Australia, witchcraft is still illegal, at least in New South Wales. It's the British Witchcraft Act of 1735 that had been repealed in England in 1951, but wasn't repealed in New South Wales until 1971. And she's openly declaring herself a witch, and she's trying to explain her beliefs continually in interviews, right? Emphasizing, you know, her pantheism and so on. And so, along with selling her paintings, she starts to use these accusations to supplement her income by casting hexes for people, sure, but also making charms and again, like enmattering and her expression and her art and her witchcraft.
Just on the human level too, of being betrayed by members of people that you hold in close confidence, that, you know, the trouble that was made for her of during a birthday party, her being flagelled, you know, having her butt whipped.
Spanking session, like, writ large is so.
And like, members of their coven steal the photographs and are planning to give them to the Sun, which then goes to the court. And, you know, they raid the house based on that as an unnatural sex act. And then the difficulty in like the notion that we all do, and it's very difficult. How do we tactfully deal with, and especially when it's people that might be close to us, that are attracted to what we do as occultists, as sorcerers, as witches, as carcists, generally, of the mental health of our close people. And that one of her main lovers, Greenlease, he collapsed and is admitted to a hospital, but he's diagnosed with schizophrenia and is readmitted and admits to trying to kill her during a specific schizophrenic episode of his. And what is the work that we do in the building of the container? And this speaking of this is like, sometimes you have to acknowledge that there's a container that must be engaged with in a way that might be beyond your ken, and that we can't solve everything with magic. We can't engage everything with magic. We can live magically, which is perhaps the next best thing, to live as if we are magic. And I don't mean that pejoratively at all, but that struck me very heavily in the relation of this, of that, you know, as a bisexual woman exploring all these notions of taboo unabashedly, having her personal life invaded constantly, as well as kind of using that to build up her own reputation in as you should, if that's what's going on. And to set your boundaries of like, I don't do animal sacrifice, I don't do a I don't do devil stuff. I do Pan and I do these things, but to have your lover try to kill you, to have to watch them go through mental health crises, and visit them after they're institutionalized, and to never see them free again in your lifetime is that struck me on a very human level.
Yeah, there's not really a sense of her falsely stoking spectacle so much as attempting to arise or float through it. Yeah,
the notion of dying from colon cancer and the sheer force of will to say, I came into the world bravely, I'll go out bravely. This is a lovely, it's not really an epithet, but like it is ultimately, it's an utterance. And I like the force of this utterance. The context is strong. There's so much in her work, her dedication to Pan as being the driving force behind so much. There was in 2000 an exhibition of her paintings entertained in heavily promoted by the OTO in Australia. That the catalog I have is beautifully done. The Occult Visions of Rosalind Norton. And she also went by the name Thorn. So I think there's also the book A Thorn in the Flesh, a grim memoir, playing on grimoire. But it's various poetry reminiscences and things by Norton herself, with some a few handful, several, maybe a half dozen artworks in there. But is just, there's some beautiful tribute to her out there, and like I said, I'm very excited when there's something like a documentary on her in this way, because it's kind of like we talk about saints, and in truth, our dead magicians are no less saints than our saints. It's just I think the notion of this, when a saint is more modern, we have much more information about their humanity as well, and in some ways, I think that makes their miracles all the more fascinating. And so too with Rosalind Norton. Her trials and tribulations as a magician, I think, can speak to all of us on these varied paths, as a model of keep it the fuck going, like do it bravely, do this shit bravely, like you're not always going to please everyone. And I think that's something in the character too, right? Like her character is about bravery. And she's going to be brave regardless of what she's doing.
Yeah, not just brilliant for the period of time she was in, but what she achieved, and at the once so modern and yet so like exemplifying these, if I may, like kind of perennial looking themes of witch and liberator.
I think, and anybody born in September or October of 1980, if we follow that, you have 40 days to find a newly conceived personage to enter into, maybe you're a reincarnation and you can give us the lamacity of it all. Anyway.
Heck yeah. It's been great to discuss and bump against each other and hammer into mirrors with which to see and ring as bells of warning and of gathering.
I mean, who is not more legion than the artist that is in their full articulation of their artistry at all times? This is the true panic, right? This is the multiple voices at once from the outer world, from the wilderness, everything that is calling out the Baptist announcing the prophesied savior, the
crisis of the possession of our genius, and how to digest it all without becoming bitter or hubristic or relying on the letter of dogma and loophole.
Yeah, certainly. Okay, so that notion that like was espoused to me by a very favored mentor of mine, of you meet someone for the first time, consensually get them rip-roaring drunk.
Right.
They'll show you
in vino veritas. Yeah.
And there is something, this is engage the small tower before the big tower comes with Wormwood, right? Of like, let's see what you are before we have to expel you. If we have to expel you. You'd have to catch me first, weirdo.
Right.
So no, this has been lovely. Thank you, Al. And Hilary, thank you for inspiring us to actually record this episode, because it might not have happened at first. And for that, I raise my grass, Hilarius, and bid you good rest with your neighbors, Lawrence and Stephen, that perhaps in death your neighbors are giving you new insights and some good conversation. And as a Catholic, I thank you, Stephen, for not being Jesus, so that I don't have to hit my head repeatedly instead of doing the sign of the cross.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Some themes to return to, and some to synthesize and further pick apart and braid back together. Yeah, Yeah, great
And I
times.
love this oracle of the episode as opposed to having to feel like I have to book report on a tarot card or the geomantic at this point of like, how do these apply to everything here? Let's see.
Yeah. We learn in the specifics, not in the generalizings. Yeah. I love it.
You can find us online at radiofreegolgotha.com. That is also the place where you can see, we try to keep it updated of current talks, classes, appearances between the good doctor and myself. You can also find us on Facebook at whatever the Radio Free Golgotha address is. But if you Google, or not Google, if you Facebook search us, we do have a page there. We also have the Folk Necromancy forum on Facebook, and we have plans for the future things this year that will expand upon these things. So stay tuned. Perhaps they already exist by the time you are within earshot of this dripping honey that is my voice. And we do have a speakeasy, at least one already planned. So check the website out, check out Speakeasy of the Dead. And if you see Al outside in the cold, let him in. Let him in.
Just scraping on the door. As soon as I'm let in, I want to go out again.
That's right. After you steal some souls. we are nothing if not legion.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us on this these sets of long walks on short tangents. Thank you so much, everyone. And
short walks and long tangents on this end. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Al, and thank you, Pope Saint Hilary.
Cheers, everyone.